But it should be, pretty easy to find. All right, let's do it. What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Nick, and I hope you guys are doing well whenever you are checking out the latest video here on the YouTube channel. Today, we have for you guys another fantastic TV-related video here. This is going to be another TV tier list, a collection of videos that I absolutely love making, and I know you guys do as well, enjoy watching them. And today, we're taking inspiration from a good buddy of mine, my friend over at Mike's Talks and Thoughts here, my good buddy Mike, and one of his older videos that he posted a few months ago called The Top 10 Best Years of TV. Now, if you haven't seen this video, definitely recommend it. It will be linked in the description, as well as Mike's channel as a whole. If you're not already subscribed over there, definitely give him a subscription. It's definitely worth your time because he puts out some incredible TV videos there, and he's on the road to 1,000 subscribers. So if we can hit it by the end of the month, that would be a huge accomplishment. But I really wanted to focus in on this top 10 video because when I first saw this a few months ago, I really enjoyed this topic. I thought this was a very unique idea, and I wanted to do my own take on it because I really think that this has a lot of potential to just have some really good debates and some really good discussions on what years in particular had the best TV shows debut in those given years. And knowing me, knowing how I do things around here, I did not want to just limit myself to 10 because there are so many incredible years out there for TV and a lot of different variety as far as both the types of shows that came out as well as the quality of those shows that we can rank on our tier list today. So I have every year here of TV ranging from 1951 up to 2021, the most recent year here in full, because of course 2022, we're only halfway through, so it wouldn't exactly be fair to rank all the shows yet that have come out this year. But 1951 to 2021 here ranked on our tier list from the God tier down to the bottom of the barrel here. And just to give you guys an idea as to kind of visualize the shows here, we also have a slideshow put together here to talk about all of the great shows and some of the not so great shows that came out each year here. You can see we have one slide per year here, and as we go through, we're going to discuss some of the more notable entries in that given year. All of the ones that, are somewhat popular, somewhat famous for having either just, being really high quality shows or being very influential in some way. And then for each year as well, I've picked one show in particular to highlight as the worst of the year that I'm calling the infamous trash. And that's just going to kind of even the playing field here and give all of these years sort of an equal chance to talk about some of the good and bad that came out and present them as equal as possible. This is obviously going to be very subjective, but I'm going to try to do it as, unbiasedly as I can, talk about the most influential and most impactful shows, but there's definitely going to be some personal opinions in there as well. So if you would like to join me in the comments, talk about what years you think are the best in TV, that is definitely the goal of this video. So join me down there and we can have some great discussions. Also, at the end of our PowerPoint here, and once we rank all of the tiers, I will present to you guys my top 10, and we'll compare that with Mike's video as well. So, with that said, let's get started here, starting off with 1951. I'll be honest with you guys, most of the years prior to, I would say about the 80s, are going to be pretty unremarkable as far as the amount of shows that we have to really go in depth on, because most of these early years don't really have that much to talk about, and 1951 is one of those. With the exception of I Love Lucy. That's definitely the biggest show out of this year. And looking at the rest of them, there's not really all that much there to really go in on. But I Love Lucy is definitely one of the most prominent, so we can start it off at the good tier. In 1952, we definitely have a lot more to offer here. Definitely some great sitcoms. You can see at the top, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet probably being the most notable. One of the longest running shows of all time there. I think it went on for like 12 or 14 seasons, which is pretty insane, as well as some pretty notable religious shows that were pretty big from the time here. But again, most of these shows haven't really aged all that well is really the big problem. The infamous trash show, it's called Report Card for Parents. It was literally a panel game show where students would talk about their report cards to their parents, and their parents would punish them for it. It was the dumbest idea for a show. It's canceled after one season, not very notable. I think that 1952, aside from, a few of the sitcoms here, is a pretty bad year for TV. Most of this stuff just has not really seen the light of day since the 50s there. For 1953, this is also a very, very bad year for TV. There were only 3 shows I could find that really had any sort of impact there. A game show, Name That Tune, a sitcom, Make Room for Daddy, also known as The Danny Thomas Show, then the infamous trash show, Backyard Farmer, which was a gardening show. Yeah, 1953 can get the hell out of here. A bad year for TV for sure. 1954 was a pretty alright year for TV, definitely a big year for dramas here. We got stuff like Lassie, Studio 57, Annie Oakley, Climax, The Big Four. We also have the start of The Tonight Show, which is pretty pretty famous rather. The infamous show this year, Flash Gordon, was one of the earliest sci-fi shows that really hasn't aged all that well. It's kind of developed a bit of a cult following, but objectively a pretty bad show as well. I think it just kind of evens out here in the meh tier. Into 1955 here, this was probably one of the stronger years for the 50s alongside 1951 because this year offered us dramas like Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which was extremely impactful for ongoing anthology series to come, most notably The Twilight Zone. You also had a lot of big westerns this year, most notably Gunsmoke, which was the longest running drama ever prior to SVU coming in and, unseating it on. You also have a lot of big westerns that started this year, most notably Gunsmoke, which formerly held the title of the longest-running drama series ever before SVU dethroned it just a couple years ago, as well as some big sitcoms this year like The Honeymooners and The Bob Cummings Show there, the $64,000 Question, one of the biggest game shows of the time, and then the Mickey Mouse Club actually started this year, which has had a few different revivals and different updated versions of that show as well. So overall, 1955, a pretty strong year. I'm going to put it on the same level as 51 there, and I would say it's a pretty solid year for TV. 1956 here, again, not the best year overall, pretty mediocre year, unless if you're a big fan of game shows, which I do like game shows, but none of these really, aside from The Price is Right, have really lasted all that long. To tell the truth, has some revivals and such as well, but nothing that really, is a must-watch by any means, and the lack of variety on this one definitely hurts it in the overall standings here. I think this is another one that just kind of goes in the meh tier. Looking at 1957, again, a lot of big dramas for this one. You got stuff in there like Perry Mason, Wagon Train, a bunch of those westerns again. That was probably the most notable format for dramas back in the day were westerns. A few big sitcoms as well, most notably Leave It to Beaver was probably the most famous of them. The infamous trash this year, Divorce Court, which started as one of the earliest courtroom shows, which is somehow still on to this day. I don't know about you guys, but all those courtroom shows like, The People's Court and Judge Joe Brown and all that stuff started with Divorce Court here from way back in the day, and those shows are unwatchable in my opinion. So overall, 1957, not the worst year by any means. I think a pretty strong one outside of the handful of just really, dismal shows there like Divorce Court, but the dramas here definitely making it up for it, and the nice variety here as well. The Tonight Show starring Jack Paar as well started this year, which is pretty cool. 1958 here, again, a lot of big dramas here. Not the best variety by any means. Another courtroom show there for the infamous trash. And the show that I found, J.P. Patches, which is apparently a show about clowns. Not really sure how to feel about that one overall. A pretty unremarkable year, I would say, overall, 1958. Once again, going in the meh tier. And closing out the decade here, we have 1959, which is, again, one of the stronger years here. We have stuff in here like The Twilight Zone. We got Bonanza, Rawhide, Adventures in Paradise. There's some big dramas in this one as well. Dennis the Menace as your flagship sitcom this year. Playboy's Penthouse, which was one of the earliest adult shows, which is pretty interesting. Definitely The Twilight Zone, is easily going to hold this one down and anchor it in the good tier once again, because that's easily one of the biggest dramas there. But Everything else, is just kind of okay. So that's the 50s for you. Not the most remarkable standings, but, a handful of all right years for this decade here, and definitely a few shows that definitely stand out and help some of these years grow up the tier list here. But I think the 60s are definitely going to give us a better result overall, starting off with 1960, which was honestly a pretty good year for animated shows. This is the first year that animation really started to spring up and really become a big format for TV, because, prior to it, it's pretty expensive to make, and it was really only something that you find in movies. But 1960 was definitely the birthplace of a lot of big animated shows, such as the Flintstones, the Bugs Bunny Show, Popeye the Sailor there, Mr. Magoo, which has had, sort of a cult following as well. There's also some big sitcoms that came out this year, the Andy Griffith Show, one of the most celebrated of the time, and then Route 66 there as your flagship drama. Overall, a pretty solid batch of programming here. I'm going to say 1960 as well belongs in the good tier. Looking at 1961 now, if you talk to certain people, TV historians, and you read different articles and such, they would lead you to believe that 1961 was the worst year in TV history. And a lot of that comes in the form of what we have here as the infamous trash You're in the Picture, which was one of the worst performing game shows of all time, with Jackie Gleason from The Honeymooners as the host. You can find a ton of different documentaries and different video essays and such online about this show. It is pretty bad. I'll say the handful of clips that have resurfaced over the years definitely do not give it the best light, but outside of that, I think the rest of these shows really do make up for the lack that show kind of brings on, because you have stuff like the Dick Van Dyke Show in here, Mr. Ed, Car 54, Where Are You?, Password as one of the best game shows ever, and then The Defenders there as your flagship drama this year. There's a good variety here. Even though You're in the Picture is definitely going to bring it down a little bit, I would say it still belongs at least in the meh tier. I don't think it's as bad as a lot of people make it out to be, because at least for Dick Van Dyke, man, that show is awesome, and that's a really, really fun sitcom there that still, brings the laugh to this day if you want just good black and white TV. So I disagree with most people on this one. I think 1961, a little bit of a better year than most people give it credit for. As is 1962, this year was really popular when it came to these late night talk shows, because this was the first year of Johnny Carson taking over for The Tonight Show. We talked about that a little bit earlier, but we also had stuff like the Andy Williams Show and the Merv Griffin Show started this year. So these talk shows and these late night shows were definitely the biggest draw for TV as a whole. You also had some big sitcoms this year as well, with the Beverly Hillbillies, the Lucy Show, which was, of course, Lucille Ball's show after I Love Lucy, and then the Jetsons started this year as your animated show. That's pretty good. And then you also have some solid game shows in there, Match Game as well, one of the most popular in that regard, and some dramas, some hospital dramas more or less, with stuff like The Nurses there, which definitely isn't that big of an appeal to me, but I know a lot of people absolutely love that particular style of dramas. So overall, another solid year. I'm going to give this a good tier as well. Taking a look at 1963, speaking of hospital dramas, this one was definitely a big year for those, with stuff like General Hospital definitely leading the pack on this one as the flagship show of the season. You also have stuff in there like The Doctors, Outer Limits, a great sci-fi series that started in 1963. Some interesting shows that really kind of laid the groundwork for particular genres that were a little bit more niche, especially at the time, but have since grown into something a lot more popular and a lot more mainstream. Stuff like The French Chef, for example, which was one of the first cooking shows on TV with Julia Child as the host, which, of course, cooking shows have since become one of the biggest for any sort of just lifestyle or daytime type of TV that you see nowadays, as well as Astro Boy, which was one of the first animes to bring over from Japan into the Western world, and it's become a flagship franchise in anime. And again, anime has become one of the biggest genres of TV as well nowadays. So this was a pretty groundbreaking year for those particular types of genres as well, and then just a really solid batch of big shows that were here domestically as well. I think that 1963, another thumbs up from me, and another one that we're going to put in the good year. But it does not compare, in my opinion, to 1964, which I personally believe as the best year of the 1960s here. And it's going to be the first year that we spring into the great tier. It's going to finally break through to that it's going to be the first one to break through to that higher echelon here on our tier list, because just take a look at the names that we have here for this particular year. We have stuff like Bewitched in here, The Munsters, one of my personal favorites, The Addams Family, Gilligan's Island, of course, one of the most celebrated sitcoms out there. For the dramas, you have stuff like The Man from U.N.C.L.E., which was a huge action franchise, Daniel Boone, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, 12 O'Clock High. Those were all really popular back in the day, and some of them still living on in syndication to this day. You also have stuff in there like Flipper and Underdog. Those were both animated series for the kids that were really big on Saturday morning cartoon blocks. And then finally Jeopardy here to really, really put this one over the top as one of the premier game shows from this year. So an absolute jam-packed year with tons and tons of classics in here. Even the infamous trash this year, Nightlife, is just, a typical news show. The only reason I put it down there is because it's not really something that I particularly like, but it's still on to this day, so you can't knock it there. It definitely still has an audience all these years later, which is very impressive. So, like I said, 1964, definitely the strongest year that we've seen thus far, definitely deserves a great tier placement. 1965 here, a little bit lesser than the one we just saw, but still a pretty solid batch of shows in this one. You have, again, big sitcoms in here like Get Smart, Hogan's Heroes, Green Acres, I Dream of Janine, F Troop. Those are all really big. Stuff like Days of Our Lives as the kind of principal big, flagship drama for this year. A lot of soap operas, of course, coming from the 1950s and 60s. You also have some cult shows in here like Honey West, which was one of those first examples of a show that people argue, was canceled too early and kind of, left off after only one season, but was really, really good and has become, a pretty popular show for the old school TV fans out there to reminisce on, which is pretty cool. Some big game shows in here, The Dating Game and Supermarket Sweep. Those are pretty big. And then you even have stuff in here like The Beatles, their animated series, which is kind of a love it, or hate it type of show, or almost like a, so bad it's good almost type of, reputation that it has garnered over the years. But still, the Beatles, right? You can't knock them at all. One of the best bands ever. So the fact that they had a show built around them because they were that successful, that's pretty cool to see all these years later. And then, of course, I would be remiss if we didn't mention the infamous trash this year, My Mother the Car, which, according to some sites such as Watch Mojo, is just simply one of the worst shows of all time. So we can't put it too high on the tier list, but I think another one that definitely deserves at least a good tier for the amount of great sitcoms and dramas that started in 1965. 1966 as well, I think, definitely went for more of a quality over quantity type of feel with their lineup here. A lot of big dramas this year, most notably Star Trek, the original series, easily one of the most impactful sci-fi shows ever made. You also have stuff in here like Dark Shadows and Mission Impossible, which were big. Batman with Adam West, of course, started this year, which is a cult favorite among superhero fans. You also have some big game shows in here, Hollywood Squares and the Newlywed Game, two of the most popular that have been revived and syndicated for many, many decades now. The Monkees here as your flagship sitcom, and then stuff like the Roadrunner show for the animated selections. The infamous trash, The 700 Club, another religious show that somehow is still on to this day, which is definitely going to be super niche here. I'm not really, too religious myself, so I don't really, find these shows all that appealing, but I get that there's an audience for it, so you can't knock it again too much there. I think that 1966 is another one that deserves the good tier. For 1967 here, we have another selection of really big dramas, such as Ironside, Dragnet, Love is a very... For 1967 here, we have another good selection of big dramas here. We have stuff like Ironside, Dragnet, Love is a Many Splendored Thing, Judd for the Defense, and CBS Playhouse. Those are really the main five that stuck out to me. You also have the Carol Burnett Show in here, one of the best variety shows out there. Spider-Man as the animated show, and then the infamous trash this year is The Flying Nun, which was one of the only sitcoms really to come out this year that has any sort of notoriety, but obviously not for the right reasons. I think that there are some decent shows in here, but there's just not a lot of them. There's definitely a lack of quantity this year, so that's going to ding it in the overall standings. I think this one deserves a meh tier overall. For 1968 here, another one that I think we're going to put up in the good tier for the overall standings because, again, a nice variety of shows. We have stuff like Hawaii Five-0, Adam 12, The Bold Ones, The Lawyers, Columbo, all really big dramas there. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, The Batman and Superman Hour, and the Archie show stuff that was kind of, in the kids block there, Saturday morning cartoons, or a more educational series like Mr. Rogers in there, which is pretty cool. And then 60 Minutes as one of the flagship shows this year, which is, of course, one of the biggest news types of shows, documentary style there, that's still on to this day, which is really, really impressive as well. The Ugliest Girl in Town there as the worst show of the year. Another one similar to The Flying Nun that's, a pretty easy target for a sitcom, just not very funny and not very, interesting overall, just kind of exists in a very kind of shallow sort of. For the worst show of the year, you have The Ugliest Girl in Town, which, similar to The Flying Nun, is one of those sitcoms that's just easy to look back on and pick on for how bad it really was. So, again, not overall the best year, but a pretty solid one at that. I think it definitely slips into the good tier overall for our tier list. And then another one that I think is super strong from the 60s here is 1969 here, definitely with these three principal animated shows and, kid shows overall to lead the pack here. Sesame Street, Scooby-Doo, Where Are You, and The Pink Panther. Undeniable classics there, all started the same year. Definitely can't go wrong with that. You also have some really big sitcoms this year, The Brady Bunch, The Bill Cosby Show, the first one prior to The Cosby Show, of course, but this was his first show that he did that, was pretty popular for its time. Definitely not as big as The Cosby Show, but obviously since then, everything with Bill Cosby has kind of tainted his career and, obviously not the best light, but still pretty notable for its time, of course. And then going back to those hospital shows again, you have the medical dramas here, stuff like Marcus Webley, MD, and Medical Center were two of the biggest dramas there. And then again, the game shows to finish it out here. Sale of the Century, The Who, What, and Where Game, and It's Your Bet. All pretty solid choices there. So I think 1969 definitely a strong contender here. I think it's definitely deserving of the great tier, especially for those top three there. Again, for the kids and the animated shows, those are really, really undeniable classics. Like I said, I think that's the strongest of the bunch. So the 60s here, I think overall a better standing than the 50s for sure. It's just, gradually improving itself. Let's see how the 70s overall rank with it, starting with 1970 here, which I think overall is a pretty solid year once again. I think this one's going to slip into the good tier. It's definitely not as many shows. Again, the quantity on this one is a little bit lacking here, but the quality definitely makes up for it. Mary Tyler Moore Show, Partridge Family, The Odd Couple, Nanny and the Professor as the principal sitcoms here. All My Children, one of the biggest soap operas from this year, McCloud and the Night Gallery for the dramas, and then the start of Monday Night Football on ABC, which was one of their principal sports shows for a very long time. I think a good tier is a fair placement for 1970. 1971, on the other hand, definitely is a little bit lacking for this particular rank here. There really isn't a lot of consistency this year. A lot of these shows kind of all exist in their own categories, and there's not really one principal genre that really, anchors this year at all, because the most notable shows are kind of all over the place. You have stuff like Soul Train and the Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour, which are like variety music type shows there, which is not really, a huge everlasting genre that you see nowadays. That was very much a product of its time, and those shows are both pretty dated looking back on them now. You have stuff like All in the Family, which of course is huge, but then next to that you have the new Dick Van Dyke Show, which was just kind of a poor man's version of course, the Dick Van Dyke Show, and just kind of a watered down version at that. You have weird stuff in here like Celebrity Bowling is, one of the most popular from this year. The Electric Company, the original version, and then that obviously had the revival later on. but that original show, again, is kind of a little bit all over the place, a mix of educational comedy, stuff for the kids, and then some more, dramatic elements. It's kind of a show that throws everything at the wall, and hopes something sticks. And then as well, the infamous trash, they're The Partners, one of the worst sitcoms by a big margin there. So overall, just not a very consistent year whatsoever. I think this one is definitely going to go in the meh tier. It does have a couple saving graces in here, like All in the Family, like I said, but outside of that, this is a pretty weak year for TV. For 1972, on the other hand, this was definitely a big bounce back from the kind of poor man's version of some of those other shows like we talked about just a second ago. 1972 had some big sitcoms in here like MASH, Sanford and Son, Maude, which was one of the spinoffs to the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and then the Bob Newhart Show as well was a huge hit. You have The Waltons, Emergency, The Rookies, Streets of San Francisco, and Kung Fu for the drama selection. You have a couple cartoons in here like Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids, Bill Cosby again showing his presence in the TV world there, and then the new Scooby-Doo movies, which was pretty big, and then a couple of oddball shows in here like the Julie Andrews Hours, which was not super popular for its time, but had amazing critical reviews. One of the biggest critical acclaimed shows of the year here, hosted by Julie Andrews' variety show, and she was a huge star at the time, so it makes sense that they would give her her own show in prime time there. And then Great Performances, which is on PBS here, and kind of a syndicated show that brings in different series from international countries, and has a lot of British shows to it. I think most notably now in its current state, it premiere shows like Downton Abbey and Call the Midwife are two of their most popular. So just kind of a syndicated package there that comes in and displays, some other international shows, which started in 1972. And then the infamous trash here. This one has gotten talked about again online quite a bit here, but Me and the Chimp, one of the worst dramas of all time, one of the worst action dramas of all time. Super stupid idea of a guy and his chimp solving the world's, mysteries and taking out these bad guys and stuff. Just such a stupid idea. So that one's definitely worth a laugh or two. But overall for 1972, I think this is a pretty solid year overall, and I think a good tier is a fair placement. For 1973 here, once again, we see the animated series really taking the crown for this year with Schoolhouse Rock, Star Trek the Animated Series, and Super Friends all taking the reins here to really anchor this one in a really good spot. You have stuff like Kojak, The Young and the Restless, Police Story, and Barnaby Jones for the dramas here. Pyramid, a really solid game show there, and then The Tomorrow Show as well to kind of siphon this one off as a pretty solid year for TV. Once again, I think we're going to go in the good tier for 1973. 1974 here, another batch of dramas you see at the top there. Rockford Files, Little House on the Prairie, Policewoman, The Night Stalker, Shazam. Those are all pretty solid. You have stuff in here like Happy Days and Good Times, some celebrated sitcoms in here, which both started in 1974. Nova, which is an educational documentary series, again on PBS, which is pretty good. And then Tattletales, another big game show here. How to Survive a Marriage in the infamous trash slot, one of the most infamous soap operas ever, which was one of the also the shortest soap operas ever. I think it only lasted for like 3 or 4 months, which is pretty short for soap operas. Usually those are year round with daily episodes put out every single weekday. But that one was, so bad that they pulled it early because no one really enjoyed it. So overall, 1974, another solid year. I think a good tier is justified there. For 1975, on the other hand, I think that this one is probably the strongest for any year in the 70s personally, because not only do you have a great crop of sitcoms this year with Phyllis, Barney Miller, The Jeffersons, Fawlty Towers, Welcome Back Kotter, and One Day at a Time, but you also have the absolute juggernaut, which is Saturday Night Live. You have a huge superhero drama with Wonder Woman, you have a massive game show with Wheel of Fortune, and you have one of the best morning news shows out there with Good Morning America. Those last four, I think, absolutely seal the deal for me as putting this one in the top spot for the 70s here, and I think this is easily going to slide up in the great tier alongside alongside 64 and 69 there, just for the amount of quality shows. Not the biggest quantity, again, aside from the sitcoms, every other genre is lacking as far as, having more than one there. But everything else, around it there, again, as far as quality goes, is absolutely top tier. Saturday Night Live, one of my favorites of all time. Wheel of Fortune, one of the most popular game shows out there. And then you have some of those sitcoms like Fawlty Towers, for example, landing in our top 100 TV shows project that we did about a year ago now. So obviously a huge, huge show there. So yeah, overall 1975, a massive win there. For 1976 as well, I thought that this was easily going to be another top tier show. For 1976 here, we have some pretty big game shows really leading the charge here. Family Feud, The Gong Show, Double Dare, those are all pretty solid. You have some dramas in here like Family, The Bionic Woman, Charlie's Angels, Quincy M.E. that were all pretty solid as well for their time. And then a few comedies in here like Alice, Laverne and Shirley, What's Happening, and The Muppet Show. I wouldn't say overall this is a amazing year. It's not like incredibly great, except for Family Feud is really the one that stands out the most to me. But overall, it's very consistent. So I wouldn't put it any lower than at least a good tier here. It could maybe slide into the great tier depending on who you ask. But for me, I think a great tier is, or a good tier rather, is a fair placement for it. With 1977, this one, not as strong as some of the other years of the 70s here. I think that this is a overall, pretty just okay year. 8 is Enough, Chips, The Amazing Spider-Man, Lou Grant, and The Love Boat as your dramas here. Three's Company and Soap as your sitcoms. The Richard Pryor Show, a nice variety comedy show there. And then Pinwheel, which was a sketch comedy show on Nickelodeon, one of the first actually on Nickelodeon there, which kind of laid the groundwork for shows like All That later on, which is pretty interesting. So yeah, overall, not a bad year by any means. I think another good year, but definitely not as strong as some of the other ones that we've seen prior in this decade. For 1978 here, definitely the For 1978, definitely the strongest genre this year, again, coming in the form of dramas once again. Dallas, Fantasy Island, The Incredible Hulk, Battlestar Galactica, and The White Shadow are the most notable names out of this one. Taxi, Mork and Mindy, WKRP, and Cincinnati in different strokes leading the way for the sitcoms, and then Card Sharks there as a solid game show to boot. I think that, again, this is not a bad year by any means, a pretty consistent one here, a pretty solid one. I think good tier is a fair placement. And then finally, as we close out the 70s here, we end on kind of a sour note with 1979. I think this is definitely one of the weaker years for this decade. You have the top genre this year being like news type shows or like, journalism type shows with stuff like Nightly Business Report, CBS News Sunday Morning, Sports Center, and Nightline, which I'm not really the biggest fan of, watching the news in general. So none of those shows really appeal to me. Probably the most notable, nowadays is probably Sports Center, because I know that's still on the air, but I'm not really a sports guy. Most people that watch this channel know that sports-related TV is just not really my cup of tea, but I get why people like it if they're into sports, of course. And then following that, you got a few dramas in here like The Dukes of Hazzard, Heart to Heart, Knots Landing. Those are just fine, but nothing that really, stands out incredibly well nowadays. The Facts of Life, Benson, and House Calls for your sitcoms, and then Password Plus and for your game shows there. The infamous trash this year, This Old House, is easily one of my least favorite shows ever, so had to put that down there. It's just a really kind of niche genre that has no mainstream appeal. It's about, woodworking and building houses essentially, and fixing, different problems that you might find out around the house, electrical problems or, plunging toilets and shit. It is just a very, very boring show in my opinion. So like I said, I think 1979 is probably one of the weaker years in TV. I could see how some people would put it up in the good tier, but for me, I'm going to go meh tier for the closer of the 70s here. To open up the 80s here, what was probably the most influential decade of TV, as I said earlier, I think that this is around the time where we really start to see a lot of shows and a lot of these networks really try to push the envelope on what, was acceptable at the time, but also just what was really, really going to stand all these years later and still As we look to the 1980s here, this was probably the most influential decade for TV, especially at the time, because this was around the time where a lot of these networks and a lot of these shows were really trying to push the envelope on what was acceptable and what was going to stick out the most to people, not just of the time, but what was going to stand the test of time and look really good in retrospect, which is, of course, what we're doing here. But it did not start out that way, because 1980 in particular is easily one of the worst for this entire project. The amount of shows here is all over the place once again. This is another example where there's, a ton of different genres represented, but none of them really have a ton of shows for each one, and the quality of these shows really range from, pretty solid to absolutely miserable. So let's go through it. To start off, I guess you would call these shows just like kind of variety shows, or, like contest type shows, game shows. That's Incredible, Chain Reaction, and Blockbusters. I don't really know what to say to these, because they're not really scripted shows. They don't really have, any kind of standings as far as characters or story goes. They're just kind of all over the place, like I said, variety type shows. But yeah, nothing really to speak on with those ones. For your sitcoms here, you have stuff like Too Close for Comfort, Stanford, Flow, and Bosom Buddies. Can't really say that I, was too familiar with any of those shows. Apparently, some of them lasted a few seasons. That's really all I can say as far as their notoriety is concerned. Texas and Magnum PI for your dramas. Their Magnum PI, probably the most recognizable of any of these, to be fair. So that one's, pretty solid with Tom Selleck as the lead there. And then the next two, Solid Gold and American Top 10, were music-related shows. American Top 10 hosted by Casey Kasem, one of the biggest radio DJs of all time. But it's literally just like, compilation-type shows, I guess you could say. There's not really a genre for it. Essentially just, talking about music that was big at the time, what were the hit songs of the week, and then just kind of, playing samples of those and showcasing those on the show. I don't know, just a really weird, outdated format that doesn't, have any bearings nowadays. And then a few of the miscellaneous shows at the bottom there: 123 Contact, Livewire, The New Adventures of the Lone Ranger, Mystery, Cosmos. Again, kind of all over the place there. The infamous Trash This Year Fridays, which was essentially ABC's attempt to bank off of SNL. It's kind of like their version of it, a live variety sketch show that was aired every Friday with a big cast of people, but obviously didn't have the same success as SNL, and is kind of looked back on as a poor man's version. So yeah, overall 1980, a total mess of a year, man. Absolutely all over the place as far as consistency and quality is concerned. Not a good year whatsoever. Unlike 1981, that is, which I would say was a pretty solid year, especially given just the absolute, shit show. Compare that to 1981, which was a pretty solid year overall for TV, especially compared to the absolute shit show that was 1980 here. A really, really golden selection of dramas this year, man. The dramas are on another level, man. Hill Street Blues, Dynasty, The Greatest American Hero, Falcon Crest, The Fall Guy, Simon and Simon. I mean, that's just hit after hit after hit there. So absolutely amazing stuff there. You have Gimme a Break and Private Benjamin for the sitcoms here. The Smurfs for your animated series, and then Entertainment Tonight started in 1981, which is a syndicated show talking about like celebrity gossip. It was one of the first to do that, which you might be like me and not really find those shows all that appealing, but they've been around for a very long time, and they will definitely continue to be around long after we are all. So you got to give them props there. 1981, again, I think a pretty solid show here, or a pretty solid year rather. I say good tier is fair. 1982, this is definitely the closest I think that any of these early 80 years, like the first half of the decade, is going to come close to cracking into that great tier. I could see an argument for definitely getting up into the great tier there, especially again with some of these dramas here. St. Elsewhere, easily one of the most influential medical shows out there. You got stuff in here like Fame, based on the movie, the musical drama movie that came out a couple years prior. T.J. Hooker with William Shatner from Star Trek, and that was a police procedural that was very big for him. Cagney and Lacey there, Knight Rider with David Hasselhoff, of course. Then Remington Steele there, a great spy thriller to round everything out. You also have some absolutely phenomenal sitcoms here with stuff like Cheers and Family Ties, Silver Spoons, Newhart, an absolute hit after hit there. Late Night with Dave Letterman started this year. At the Movies started this year. That's Roger and Ebert, of course, the famous movie critics there, and then Starcade to round it out as a game show. Joni Loves Chachi, easily one of the worst sitcoms out there, a terrible spin-off idea. So we can just ignore that one. But 1982 overall, a really, really solid year. Definitely another one that, again, you could debate up in the great tier. I think most of those shows, personally, for me, a lot of those dramas, they're definitely, huge for their time, but they're not really something I would go back to all that much. You could argue they're kind of dated as well. Never really been the biggest fan of Letterman personally, but obviously he has just a huge, huge impact on late night TV. So there's an argument to be had here, but personally, I would still put this one at the good tier. For 1983 here, this was another big year dominated primarily by animated shows. You have Inspector Gadget, the new... For 1983 here, this was definitely a year dominated heavily by animated shows, specifically stuff like Inspector Gadget, the new Scooby and Scrappy show, Alvin and the Chipmunks, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, The Littles, and Fraggle Rock there, as well as Reading Rainbow I threw in there because that's another one that's for the kids and definitely targeting a younger demographic there, and obviously a huge, huge educational show there, so I had to include that one. Your next big batch is for the game shows this year. You have Match Game and Hollywood Squares Hour, Love Connection and Star Search, The A-Team as one of the principal dramas, and then Mama's Family to tie everything together for one of the most underrated sitcoms, man. Mama's Family, I jokingly say sometimes about this show that this is like the Two Broke Girls of the 80s, man. This was a very popular show, but for some reason, everyone in retrospect hates this show. I don't know why. I've absolutely loved it, so I couldn't bear and put it in the infamous trash. I just couldn't do it. Vicki Lawrence is just too damn good in this role. This is definitely one of the most underrated classic sitcoms, in my opinion. Deserves way more attention. As for the infamous trash role, the actual show that belongs in there is After MASH, which was the very, very poorly received spinoff to the hit show MASH there. Absolutely just terrible. Just absolutely horrible, man. Nobody should have to suffer that one. Even if you're not the biggest fan of MASH, you can still appreciate just how big it was, but even the most diehard MASH fans stay away from After MASH. So that's pretty much my thoughts on that one. But overall, for 1983, I think this was another solid year for TV, man. Another one that's going to go in that good tier. Again, naturally, most of these early shows, or most of these early years, rather, they haven't really lasted as long. They're not as relevant, so that's going to ding them a little bit. Once we get into the 90s, 2000s, that's when we're definitely going to see a lot more up in this upper echelon of the tier list. But for now, you can't really argue against most of these. I think there is a really, really solid amount of TV to come from these early decades, and I think a good tier is totally fair for a placement here, including that. Following that one, let's also talk about 1984 here. Now, this one is a little bit tricky to pick a tier for it because the biggest show by far that started in 1984 was The Cosby Show. And obviously, if you know anything about The Cosby Show, and you know that its reputation has really gone to shit in the last decade or so, given Bill Cosby's reputation. So as far as that being, the biggest show this year, if you're looking at it just at face value, as far as when it was out, not knowing anything about what was going on behind the scenes of it, and just looking at the quality of the show that was put out, I think there's an argument to be had that it's still somewhat salvageable. There's enough of a good family dynamic that the show carries. There's, solid writing there. There's solid acting from everybody, Cosby included. It's a show that you could hypothetically still argue is a really solid TV show without any bearings on the personal lives of any of the actors. And assuming that, we're looking at these shows as far as when they came out and their reputation within that time period, The Cosby Show was the #1 show on TV for 5 years running, and it basically single-handedly saved NBC as a network. So it has huge, huge, huge implications as far as just being a show that dominated TV for as long as it did. It's a tricky one to, discuss, again, objectively, but for our purposes here, I'm going to say it's the front runner from this batch, and it absolutely holds a huge, huge amount of impact for this year going forward. Aside from that, there were some other big dramas, or sitcoms rather, this year, such as Who's the Boss, Kate and Natalie, Night Court, Punky Brewster, Three's a Crowd, and Charles in Charge, all 80s cheese fests that people absolutely love, so fair enough there. For the dramas here, you got Miami Vice, Murder, She Wrote, Airwolf, Riptide, and Hunter. For kids shows, you have stuff like Kids Incorporated, one of the biggest sketch comedy shows from Canada, of all places. So that was a big international show that started in 1984. You have My Little Pony started in 1984. Thomas the Tank Engine, Voltron, Muppet Babies, and the Transformers. They're another good crop of kids shows. And then Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, which is kind of like a miscellaneous show. It was kind of the first attempt at like a reality series focused in on celebrities of sorts, kind of like a precursor to almost like an MTV Cribs style show where they go and they tour these houses and, they talk to these people about all their assets and such. Pretty interesting, the contrast that you have compared to obviously something like MTV Cribs later in the 2000s there. But that was kind of the but that was kind of an example of what it was like as an 80s version of that. So that was a big show this year. But yeah, 1984, I mean, again, with the Cosby Show, there's arguments to be had that it could go pretty much anywhere on this tier list, but I'd argue a good tier is justified. Looking at 1985 here, this was another one dominated very heavily by cartoons and animated shows, most notably the Berenstain Bears, which is easily my favorite out of any of these. Thundercats, the Raccoons, the Care Bears, and G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero all started this year, so pretty solid batch of stuff for the kids once again. You have the Golden Girls, 227, Mr. Belvedere, What's Happening Now, and Growing Pains for your sitcoms, and then a solid batch of dramas to round everything out. Moonlighting, The Equalizer, MacGyver, and Street Hawk there. So again, 1985, a pretty solid batch. I don't think anything super groundbreaking here, but, good enough to put in the good tier. For 1986 here, a big, big crop of sitcoms here for this year. You have stuff like Alf, Amen, Head of the Class, Perfect Strangers, The Hogan Family, It's Gary Shandling's Show, and Designing Women. They're all really, really solid comedies from this year. 1986 also gave us a good amount of kids shows once again, such as The Real Ghostbusters, Pee-wee's Playhouse, Dennis the Menace, and Double Dare. Not the Double Dare that you might be thinking of on Nickelodeon, but a different Double Dare that was a different game show. '86 also gave us a good amount of stuff for the kids once again, children's TV, with The Real Ghostbusters, Pee-wee's Playhouse, Dennis the Menace, and Double Dare for those types of series. You also have stuff in here like At the Movies, which was another Roger and Ebert show, as well as The Oprah Winfrey Show, which, of course, everyone knows Oprah there, and then two really popular dramas that, dramas this year were not very big, as far as the quantity once again, but the two that we got were absolutely massive and really, really took over TV, and those were Matlock and LA Law. There, two that are still in syndication to this very day. The infamous trash this year, Life with Lucy, was another Lucille Ball sitcom that started, well after I Love Lucy, but this is definitely one of her most, frowned upon ones, because this was just so far after her golden age, and, this was like kind of just, forcing people to watch Lucille Ball at this point. People had been way over her at this point, and a lot of her good reputation was starting to wear thin on people. So yeah, this one definitely looked at as one of her weaker shows in her filmography. But outside of that, I think 1986 was a pretty solid year once again. I think a good tier is where it's going to go. All right, 1987 here. This is easily, without question, one of the most important years for TV, especially considering the transitioning from that. Let's take a look at 1987 here. 1987 was easily one of the most important years for TV because of the introduction to the Fox network. I don't need to tell you, especially if you are up to date with your current TV, that Fox has since become one of the flagship TV networks amongst the big five in the US here. And they got their roots in 1987 with a few series that I believe personally to be the strongest within their individual genres of this entire year, which were 21 Jump Street when it came to the dramas, Married with Children when it came to the comedies, and the Tracey Ullman Show when it came to the variety sketch series. Leading the pack in their respective genres here, well above any of the others that came out this year. All on the same network that started in 1987. That's pretty revolutionary. That's pretty remarkable. Props to Fox for sure for coming out of the gate super strong with just an abundance of good TV. But it wasn't just Fox that was putting their best foot forward this year. You also got a lot of really good stuff in general from all the other networks. The Bold and the Beautiful, still one of the most popular soap operas to this day. Beauty and the Beast, not the movie, obviously, from Disney, but just a classic drama there. Star Trek The Next Generation, one of the most critically acclaimed, and 30-something as well, a really good comedy drama that started this year. For the comedies, obviously Married with Children, like we said, but also A Different World, the spinoff to The Cosby Show, Full House. When it came to the comedies here, you have stuff, of course, like Married with Children, as we talked about, but also A Different World, the spinoff to The Cosby Show, Full House, My Two Dads, Duet, and Hooperman, starring the late, great John Ritter. You also have, alongside the Tracey Ullman Show, Showtime at the Apollo, hosted by the wonderful Steve Harvey, and Dolly, hosted by Dolly Parton, as well as some other variety shows that really stuck out this year. And then stuff in the animated genre, DuckTales, TMNT, and Bionic 6. The infamous trash this year, the Tortellis, a spinoff to... The spinoff to the infamous trash this year being the Tortellis, the spinoff to the wonderful Cheers, as we talked about earlier. Yeah, this show obviously does not have the same repertoire. Fuck me. As for the infamous trash this year, that show being the Tortellis here, which was a spinoff to the wonderful Cheers, as we saw earlier. Yeah, obviously, the show does not have the same reputation as Cheers. It's very, very poorly received once again, was canceled after one season. Pretty much checks all the boxes for a really bad TV show. But everything else around it that came out in 1987, even, disregarding Fox and, the fact that it started the whole channel this year, just the shows themselves that came out this year, 1987 easily holds the distinction of being one of the most influential, one of the most important years for TV, and the closest that we've seen so far to cracking into that A1 tier. I don't think it's quite up there, knowing what's to come in some of these later years, but it's super, super close, and it definitely is one of the most important, like I said. When it comes to 1988, this was another one that was, pretty solid overall. Nothing that's too, super, super crazy, but a pretty good batch of sitcoms, at least, to hold down this one, with the biggest of them all being Roseanne here. You also have Murphy Brown, Empty Nest, Just the 10 of Us, Dear John, and The Wonder Years there, all pretty solid. 48 Hours and America's Most Wanted. There are some news type shows that have both been, revived and revisited a bunch of different times. In the Heat of the Night as your principal drama this year. You have Yo, MTV Raps here. MTV started, a few years prior to this, but they didn't really come into the forefront of original programming until the late 80s into the early 90s, as we'll talk about a little bit later. And this was one of their big, shows that really was, kind of the most current of all of their original programming that they had at the time, because it focused on hip hop, and that was, the burgeoning genre in music at the time. So that was obviously a very smart play for them. Mystery Science Theater 3000, a great cult show. And then the infamous trash of this year, TB 101, which sounds like a good idea in theory, a show talking about a high school class that focuses on TV and, the industry of TV, but for some reason just couldn't connect the dots with viewers there, and, was canceled really early as well. But overall, 1988, like I said, not the most crazy good year for TV, but a pretty solid one nevertheless. I think a good tier, once again, is a safe bet. However, none of these years of the 80s or anything prior could prepare you for how good and how impactful 1989 really was. You see that little asterisk there? Every year that we come across on the slideshow there with an asterisk indicates that this was actually part of Mike's video that we referenced at the beginning of this video, and it shows that this was on his list. This actually made it to the top 5, in fact, primarily because of 3 huge sitcoms that started in this year: The Simpsons, Seinfeld, and Family Matters. Family Matters might seem a little out of place there compared to the other two, but for Mike especially, he's a huge Family Matters guy, absolutely loves all the characters, especially the, very, very famous and funny Steve Urkel there, of course. Jaleel White, great actor. Jaleel White, easily one of the best actors out there. And for me, I've seen a good amount of Family Matters as well. I can say it's definitely deserving of a little more credit. I think it's a pretty underrated show myself, so I would definitely put it up there in the top 3 sitcoms for this particular year. That was jam-packed with a lot of good ones, because even outside of those 3, you have Coach and Saved by the Bell, Doogie Howser, Major Dad. Those were all huge at the time. The next big genre for 1989 came in the form of these talk shows, once again, these late night shows. The Arsenio Hall show started this year, and Arsenio Hall, man, is gone down as one of the best to ever do the late night circuit. He just had such a revolutionary, hip and current sort of feel and tone with his show. He had, a lot of big guests that would come out. A lot of big moments in late night history kind of sprung from his show. So that was a really important. The next big crop of shows came in the form of, again, these late night talk shows and these late night comedy shows with stuff like Arsenio Hall, Pat Sajak, who at one point had his own late night show, if you didn't already know, Joan Rivers, and Byron Allen. A lot of these people kind of made their careers out of these shows before they went on to do bigger and better things, especially Arsenio Hall easily being the most famous of all these mentioned here. For the dramas, you have stuff like Baywatch in there, a great cult show. Quantum Leap, which is actually getting a reboot this year coming up in 2022, which will be very exciting, and Life Goes On. You also have some more miscellaneous shows towards the bottom there, stuff like Cops, Inside Edition, Rescue 911, and America's Funniest Home Videos. All of those in some form still on to this day again, which is very impressive. But again, I wouldn't be remiss if I didn't talk about the infamous trash here, which is Free Spirit, which if you've seen some of my previous videos, you already know how bad and how awful that show is. Allison Hannigan, man, that was her first show on TV. Man, did not deserve that, because absolutely awful stuff. But Everything outside of that, I mean, this is as close to as top tier as we have gotten so far, man. 1989, just such a landmark year for TV. I mean, obviously, do not blame Mike at all for putting this up. It probably could be higher, to be honest with you. Only number 5 kind of undersells it a little bit, but yeah, this is easily a 1 tier. This is easily the best year that we've seen so far. And with that, it's a great closer for the 1980s, which, like I said, was probably the most influential decade for TV, easily up until this point. Jumping into the 1990s, though, already out of the gate with 1990 itself, brought some really big shows already to kick off the decade in a massive way. Stuff like Law and Order, Twin Peaks, Northern Exposure, Swamp Thing, Beverly Hills 90210. For the dramas here, you have stuff like The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air leading the pack with a great collection of sitcoms. Wings, Blossom, Evening Shade, Get a Life, Mr. Bean. How could you go wrong there? And then In Living Color to round it out there. Easily one of the best sketch comedy shows out there. And another one that really put Fox on the map once again. That was another big show for them following their launch in 87, and then with The Simpsons in 89 practically becoming a household name, after their first season. They were on top of the world there, and then In Living Color just brought a whole nother group of people to the Fox channel, which was huge for them. So yeah, 1990, another one that I think we're going to go really high with. We're going to put in the great tier there. Obviously not as many shows you can see there. Again, quantity is a little bit lacking here, but the quality here is unmatched. 1991 was surprisingly a big year for Nickelodeon, of all channels. We've been talking a lot about network TV, but from this point onward, cable is going to become a big factor in some of these shows, and then later streaming will become a big factor. And for 1991, 3 of the biggest Nickelodeon cartoons all started in the same year. Not only just in the same year, but on the same day, in fact. That's how big Nickelodeon was at the time, with Doug, Rugrats, and Ren and Stimpy all starting on the exact same day, which is pretty revolutionary. You also had Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, The Adventures of Pete and Pete, and Clarissa Explains It All. Those were all big for kids shows, and those were all live action kids shows. So you have a good mix of live action and cartoons for a younger audience. The also infamous group of shows that you could kind of call the tabloid shows, or these, talk shows, stuff like Jerry Springer, Maury, and Montel Williams all started as well in 1991 and was kind of the birthplace of those types of shows. Charlie Rose I threw in there, definitely not in the same league as those other ones, but still a talk show in its own right on PBS. For sitcoms, you have stuff like Home Improvement, Brooklyn Bridge, Step by Step Dinosaurs, Nurses, and Rock, a great selection of those. And then for the dramas, that's definitely the weakest genre in particular for this batch. The dramas this year, again, not super special, but the most notable of them, probably The Comish, which starred a pre-The Shield Michael Chiklis before he went on to do The Shield. He was in The Comish for 5 seasons, and that's kind of where he got his start. And then you also have Sisters and Dark Shadows there, a great cult show with Sam Raimi behind it, which is pretty interesting. So yeah, overall 1991 I don't think was as big as the year that kicked off the decade, 1990, but it was still a pretty good one overall. So you got to give credit where credit is due. And like I said, Nickelodeon, man, absolutely slayed 1991. They had obviously these 3 cartoons, and then as well Pete and Pete and Clarissa Explains It All of those on Nickelodeon. So they just had a great year there. But everybody else, a solid one, but nothing that's going to set the world on fire. For 1992 here, another year that I think was dominated mostly by cartoons once again. Batman the Animated Series, X-Men, Sailor Moon, Capital Critters, Lamb Chop, all really solid selections there. For sitcoms, you had stuff like Mad About You, Hearts of Fire, Martin, Golden Palace, Hanging with Mr. Cooper, and Larry Sanders Show. For the when it came to these sorts of news type shows or more unscripted stuff. You had stuff like Dateline, Inside Politics, and Rush Limbaugh, the television show. He has formerly hosted a radio show for many, many decades now, I think starting in the late 80s there, and it was very popular, so they decided to give him a TV show, and it was popular as well, so can't knock him there. For dramas, you had a good selection as well with stuff like Melrose Place, Picket Fences, and Are You Afraid of the Dark, another big Nickelodeon show there. And then The Tonight Show with Jay Leno and The Real World also rounding out this group of TV shows for 1982 there. The infamous trash Barney and Friends. Everyone knows Barney, man. Everyone hates Barney, man. That's pretty much all you need to say there. But overall, 1982, I think another one that belongs in the good tier. Nothing that's, super, super amazing in here, but just a really solid batch of shows. With 1983, when it comes to 1993, on the other hand, though, this easily was, I think, one of the biggest snubs off of Mike's list, because this was a fantastic year for TV, man. This is probably the most amount of shows that we've seen thus far for any one year, especially those dramas, man. So big that, I had to shrink the font size to fit them all in there in one row, but we have stuff like Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, NYPD Blue, The X-Files, Babylon 5, The Quinn Medicine Woman, Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman, Homicide: Life on the Street, Diagnosis Murder, Hotel Room, and Walker, Texas Ranger, man. Just an absolute stampede of great dramas there. For the comedies, you had stuff like Beavis and Butthead, Frasier, Living Single, Boy Meets World, The Nanny, Grace Under Fire, the former there hosted by... When it came to comedies here, a great selection of all different types and all different subgenres. Beavis and Butthead, Living Single, Boy Meets World, The Nanny, Grace Under Fire. The latter there created by the wonderful Chuck Lorre, of course. You guys know I am a huge Chuck Lorre fan, so Grace Under Fire, definitely one of his best shows. For stuff for the kids and the younger generation, you got Mighty Morphin Power Rangers that started this year, which obviously kicked off the incredibly big franchise that is Power Rangers. Bill Nye the Science Guy, hugely nostalgic show there. Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, Animaniacs, and Rocko's Modern Life. Yet again, another huge Nickelodeon show that started in the early 90s, man. That was really the golden years for Nickelodeon getting their start. Some sports shows that also started in 93. WWF Monday Night Raw and Monday Night Countdown, which was ESPN's football show that started this year. And then some more late night shows in this one. David Letterman once again moving from CBS, and then to round it out here, a good selection of late night shows here with David Letterman, once again, his second show now that we've seen, and Conan O'Brien also getting his start in 1980. And then to round it out here, we have a handful of really big late night shows. Once again, stuff like David Letterman, his second show now, and Conan O'Brien and Ricky Lake getting their start in 93 as well there. Even the infamous Trash Show was also a late night show with the Chevy Chase show there. Chevy Chase, of course, a huge famed comedian known probably best for his days on SNL there, and then later on shows like Community, where he was a lead role, or a lead cast member rather, but in between those, he had stuff like the Chevy Chase show, which was just a really bad attempt to put him back in the spotlight and failed miserably there as one of the worst. But outside of that, man, 93 was just jam-packed with so much good stuff here, so much variety. There were a few shows in there that I didn't mention as, being particularly great. Stuff like Frasier I skipped over because Frasier, I think, is pretty overrated, to be honest with you. Never really been a big Frasier guy myself, and that's definitely one of the biggest here, so got to take that into consideration. But this is another one that you could totally make an argument for getting up in the A1 tier. I don't think it's as good as 89 personally, because it doesn't have like a Seinfeld or a Simpsons equivalent in it, but it certainly just has so much stuff that's pretty undeniable any way you look at it. Coming back down to earth a little bit with 1994, this is a pretty solid year as well. And I think depending on the person you ask, this could be up in the great or possibly even A1 tier. But this is another example of a lot of these shows just not really being my cup of tea, and it falling on the tier list a little bit lower there. Stuff like The Critics, Space Coast Coast to Coast, The Magic School Bus, another hugely educational, nostalgic show there. Spider-Man, Real Monsters, and Reboot. Those are all for the animated series, once again, that really was the real anchor for 1994. Then for some of these following that, some of the Following that, some of the live-action kids series here, stuff like All That, Where on Earth is Carmen Sandiego, and The Secret Look. Following that, you also have stuff like All That, Where on the Earth is Carmen Sandiego, and The Secret World of Alex Mack. Those are live-action kids shows there that were big for the year. The dramas had a lot of big names in it as well, such as ER, Chicago Hope, Party of Five, My So-Called Life, and New York Undercover. For the sitcoms here, arguably the biggest TV show ever made, Friends, started in 1994, as well as Sister Sister, Ellen, and All American Girl, and then at Breakfast Time, which is a pretty obscure show, but has just a hugely dedicated fan base to it. If you know, I'm just going to leave it at that. The infamous trash this year, The Cosby Mysteries, man, another Bill Cosby show. This one, I believe, was animated, which is quite interesting. He did the voice for it. But yeah, obviously with Bill Cosby, a lot of this stuff hasn't aged well. Unless it's The Cosby Show, most of his other work at this point is just completely thrown out as being just absolute garbage. And this is an example of just that. So, like I said, depending on who you ask here, I feel like 1984 could definitely be a lot higher for certain people. For me personally, I think I'm only going to go in the good tier, though, with it, because there's a lot of shows on here that I think are, a little bit overrated, such as Friends, Chicago Hope, Party of Five. Ellen is definitely one as well. Ellen DeGeneres is another person that did a lot of different TV shows throughout the years. And again, her reputation has soured for a lot of people as well in recent years. So, a lot of her older stuff just kind of looked back on with, not as fond memories as much as they once were. So that's another example of that. And then there's also some of those animated shows that, I'm just not as familiar with as some other people. So like I said, this one's definitely debatable. But for me, I'm just going to go in the good tier for 94 there. As for 95 here, this is another one that I think is really, really hard to defend, because there's a lot of shows in here personally that I just do not like whatsoever. The biggest of them definitely being the Drew Carey Show, which is part of that legion of sitcoms at the top there. The Drew Carey Show, infamously, is one of my least favorite shows ever on TV. I've mentioned that plenty of times on this channel. Just absolutely cannot get behind it whatsoever. I'm not a Drew Carey guy at all, so anything that he touches is instantly bad in my eyes. Yeah, just cannot stand that show. But it's not even the worst show on this entire list, amazingly, because you also have Street Fighter down there, the animated series, in the infamous trash pile. As far as, all the other ones, I think, honestly, one of the stronger genres this year was probably the dramas here. You have stuff like Xena Warrior Princess, Star Trek Voyager, Hercules, The Outer Limits, Jag. I mean, those are all pretty solid, but again, this is just for me, very personal here. Just because of the Drew Carey Show alone, I think it has to cap out at meh. I can't put it any higher than that. Even if everything else in here was just amazing top tier stuff, Drew Carey is just going to bring it down for me. So unfortunately, 95, not the best year for TV. 96, on the other hand, I think is a pretty solid return to form for TV. I think this one belongs in the good tier here. Some really, really big sitcoms once again here, such as Third Rock from the Sun, Moesha, The Jamie Foxx Show, Kenan and Kel, Steve Harvey Show, Spin City, Suddenly Susan, Malcolm and Eddie, Everybody Loves Raymond, which again, I'm not the biggest fan of, but it's a big show regardless, and Sabrina the Teenage Witch. A lot of big African-American shows this year because of UPN really trying their hand at a lot of sitcoms. So that's how you got stuff like the Steve Harvey Show and Moesha, stuff like that, that came out of, their season here. For the animated shows, you have Dexter's Laboratory, Blue's Clues, Superman the Animated Series, Dragon Ball Z, Arthur, Hey Arnold, and Kablam. Those are all pretty solid as well. And then for the dramas here, that's definitely the weakest category for this year. Seventh Heaven, Nash Bridges, and Early Edition are the only three, and none of those really stand out all that much. So not the worst year ever, but just kind of an underwhelming year overall for the 90s. I'm going to say good tier, but it's definitely not as strong as some of the other ones we've put up there previously. 1997, on the other hand, is the total opposite of that, because this is just a flat-out great year for TV. This is now the second one that we've seen that was on Mike's list. This came in at number 7 in his video, and again, you can't really blame him there. He cites the big three, as he calls it, with this year, which are the main 3 shows that he, thinks really held down this year as one of the best, which were South Park, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and Oz. And, after looking at the list, I would say that's a pretty solid selection there. I would personally have Dharma and Greg in the top 3 because that's just a personal choice for me. I'm a big fan of that show. But, as far as just objectivity goes, I think those are pretty solid choices there. Again, animated shows really taking over for this year with stuff like South Park, of course, King of the Hill, Daria, Recess, The Angry Beavers, Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, Bear in the Big Blue House. I mean, there's a ton of them that you can cite there. Again, pretty solid group of dramas there. We talked about some good sitcoms in here. Antiques Roadshow started this year, another PBS show that's kind of in the miscellaneous one. But the infamous trash this year is, again, going to bring it down just a little bit here with Arsenio. That was his second attempt at a late-night show, Arsenio Hall, we talked about. And this one just completely fell on its face, man. There was a network change. There was a lot of stuff behind the scenes with some of the producers that, he kind of clashed heads with. And they always cite creative differences, right, is why the show kind of tanked. But yeah, this was just a really bad attempt to put him back in the spotlight. But honestly, outside of that, 1997 was a very strong year for TV. I think this is definitely going to go in the great tier. With 1998, this one, again, is a bit of a sleeper pick. There are some really good comedies in 1998 here that I think get left on too many people do not cite them as much as they should. Stuff like That 70s Show, The King of Queens, Will and Grace, Two Guys That Grow on a Pizza Place, Becker and Jesse, all really solid shows there, with 3 of my personal favorites up there. That 70s Show, King of Queens, and Will and Grace. I mean, that's a great trio for sitcoms, man. Alone, that would definitely put it up in the great tier for me. When it comes to the animated shows, you got Pokemon, Cat Dog, Wild Thornberrys, and Powerpuff Girls, a nice variety. For the dramas, again, not as strong here, with most of these shows being pretty dated by now. Dawson's Creek, Sex and the City, Felicity, and Charmed. With the right audience, I get why those shows are popular, but definitely not for me personally. And then some of the more miscellaneous stuff would be like X-Play, Whose Line Is It Anyway, and TRL all started this year. Teletubbies down there as the infamous trash, man. Teletubbies, one of the weirdest kids shows ever, man. Did not understand the hype for it. Even as a kid, always avoided Teletubbies. Just could not get by that. So yeah, definitely worthy of that infamous trash title that we have there. But everything else around it, man, 1998 is a great year for TV. Arguably an even better one than 97, I would say, just based off of those comedies. I think really a strong push there as being one of the best for TV. But it does not hold a candle to that of 1999, my friends. 1999 will forever and always be not only my favorite year for TV, but the year that I would consider, without question, the best year ever for TV. Mike also agrees here, putting it in the top 3 in his video, coming in at number 3, which honestly is a great placement for it. I'm not going to argue with him on that. Definitely deserves to be in the top 3, but I would say, again, kind of undersells it here because, man, the amount of just high quality, top tier shows in every category is undefeated. When it comes to the dramas here, if you ask anybody what's the best drama out there, you would get a ton of different answers, but 4 that you often hear cited as some of the best in their respective subgenres as well: Law & Order SVU, The West Wing, The Sopranos, and Freaks and Geeks. And guess what year all 4 of those came out in? 1999. You also have the best assortment of animated series ever put on TV. I think 1999 was the best year for animated TV, period, with Family Guy and SpongeBob, two shows that I would put in my top 3 favorite cartoons ever, and 2 that I would put in my top 10 favorite shows ever, both again starting in 1999. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because you also have after that home movies, One Piece, Futurama, Ed, Edd n Eddy, The PJs, Kipper, and Dragon Tales. Again, a huge variety, adult animation, anime, kids animation. You have everything checked off here, all in one fantastic year. You also have 2 huge late-night talk shows this year with The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and The Late Show with Craig Kilborn that are fan favorites, and then a good amount of variety here as part of the miscellaneous shows that didn't really fit into any of these categories, but are all worth mentioning in their own right. The Amanda Show, one of the best sketch comedy shows ever, especially for Nick. WWE SmackDown, one of the biggest sports shows ever. I'm not even a big wrestling guy, but this show was inescapable in the 2000s. When I was growing up in elementary school and middle school, everybody watched SmackDown, man. That was a huge, huge show in my youth, and it started in 1999. So again, cannot take that away from it. Good Eats here with Alton Brown, one of the biggest for Food Network and one of my favorite cooking shows of the time. And then Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, easily one of the most influential game shows with, of course, the late, great Regis Philbin, man, rest in peace, absolute legend. And not only was that one of the best shows, but it was also the biggest show. The biggest show on TV this year was a game show, really setting in what was to come for the 2000s with the boom of reality TV and game shows really coming into their own right. And Who Wants to Be a Millionaire really setting that off there. Now, I will say the elephant in the room here, when you look at this list, there is one very notable category missing. The lack of any really big live action sitcoms. I will totally admit that that is a big red flag here. The fact that there's no big sitcoms in this year is a little bit of a bummer. You also have Angela Anaconda as the worst show of the year, which is, by far the worst show of the year. Definitely not touching any of those great animated shows, would not put it in the same league as any of those. If you ask my brother Matt, he will tell you that that's the worst show of all time, which I totally understand. So based on those 2 arguments, you could say that 1999 does not deserve the top tier status that I'm going to give it, but you cannot hold it against me for putting it up here, because just based on 3 shows in particular, really based on SVU, SpongeBob, and Family Guy. I mean, those are really the only 3 you need, but with such a great supporting cast behind it and so much variety and so many just, huge revolutionary, groundbreaking shows behind it, I mean, 1999 was just a juggernaut year. So this is easily getting God tier. It's probably going to be the only year up there for God tier, because I think it's in a league of its own. And like I said, for Mike, top 3, I mean, we're in agreement there that it's easily one of the best. Unfortunately, though, as we transition away from the best year in TV, we have to talk about what I consider to be the worst year in TV, which also happened to be the year that I was born, 2000. This list is pretty dreadful. I gotta be honest with you, man. The only show out of this entire batch that I think has any sort of salvaging or, is good in pretty much any way is Malcolm in the Middle. Malcolm in the Middle fucking rules, right? Easily deserves its reputation as being one of the best in its category. It's easily one of the funniest shows out there, so I will totally give you that. But everything else that's on screen right now is either, I think, pretty overrated, hasn't aged well, or is just flat out awful. And there is no comparison there. Curb Your Enthusiasm, super overrated. Aqua Teen Hunger Force, pretty overrated. Clifford hasn't really aged all that well. It was definitely a big childhood show for me and Matt growing up, but, I haven't returned to it at all in probably like close to 15 years now. There are way better shows from PBS Kids and, from the animated scene of the time that I have gone back to way more than Clifford or Between the Lions or George Shrinks or anything out there. And then Dora out there, oh, get Dora the fuck out of there, man. Terrible show. Not even close to the worst, though, which is a really bad sign. For the dramas here, a very sparse amount here, just not a very big list at all. CSI as really the leader in this pack. You know, it's CSI. Take that for what it's worth, I guess. It's popular, but I don't know. I take Law and Order any day. You know, Law and Order easily trumps CSI for me. Gilmore Girls is probably the best out of any of these dramas, I will say. But again, it's a pretty niche show. And in its prime, it wasn't super popular. It really was a show that took a long time to develop a sort of fan base behind it. And it's one of those shows that, you know, more in retrospect, people have gone back and looked at it as being a bigger show than maybe it was at the time. So that's another strike against it. Soul Food, couldn't name you a single person that even knows what this show is, and Ed for the same thing. Those were two of the most popular dramas, and I had never heard of them prior to doing research for this video. But then you come to the bottom of the barrel game shows that we have for this list. Well, game shows, reality shows, whatever you want to call them. But we have two of the absolute worst that both started in the same year. Survivor, which has easily got to be one of the most overrated TV shows of all time, man. I don't understand how people watch Survivor. I fucking hate Survivor. Couldn't get through a single episode of it. Absolutely awful. And then Big Brother in the same year is just a 1-2 punch of disaster. Absolutely terrible show. MTV Cribs as well hasn't aged well. We kind of referenced it earlier. Yeah, definitely not a show that you would go back to. But none of this, anything up there, Survivor, Big Brother, Dora, anything of that doesn't even start to compare to the infamous trash that we have selected for 2000, which is Kai-fucking-Yu. I cannot stress this enough, man. Kai-Yu is single-handedly the worst cartoon ever made. It's single-handedly the worst kids show ever made. In a huge variety-filled, quality entertainment genre that is the animated cartoon world, Kai-Yu had to be as fucking popular as it was. I can't even fucking believe that shit. It was more popular than Clifford or George Shrinks or Dora. It was the most popular kids show of the year, and it's also by far the worst. There are so many dedicated places online all these years later with people just, you know, built up all this rage and hatred against Kai-Yu to put into Facebook pages and YouTube channels and Twitter threads expressing their distaste for this fucking show that came out 2 decades ago. There is that much of a community that just rips on Kai-Yu every single day, and I am here for it because it totally deserves it. If after looking at that list and after my arguments you still don't think that 2000 is the worst year for TV, there's something wrong with you, man, because this is bottom of the barrel. All right, let's move on to something a bit more positive here and go to 2001. I would say, honestly, 2001 was a huge comeback for TV. I mean, after the absolute fucking nightmare that is 2000. 2001, really, really solid stuff. You got Fairly Odd Parents, Harold and the Purple Crayon, The Proud Family, Invader Zim, Bob the Builder, Samurai Jack, Braceface, The Popeye Show, and most notably, no fucking Kai-Yu this year. In 2001 for the animated scene. That's a really good selection there. Dramas all over the map here for the types of shows and sort of the subgenres here, but all doing a fairly consistent job as well, with 6 Feet Under, Smallville, 24, Undeclared, and Band of Brothers. The one that I, kind of begrudgingly put up there is Law & Order Criminal Intent, because it's definitely my least favorite of all the Law & Orders. Not a fan, but it was very popular. The cooking shows this year, actually a pretty strong batch of those. You have stuff like America's Test Kitchen that started this year, Unwrapped, and 30-Minute Meals, which are all pretty good. The Amazing Race started this year, which is easily CBS's best reality show, way better than Survivor or Big Brother. I mean, those, not even comparable. And then the sitcoms this year as well, a fairly popular selection. A few in here that I think are maybe pretty overrated and not really for me. Stuff like Scrubs and Grounded for Life and Degrassi, those aren't really my cup of tea. But there's some good stuff in here, like Bernie Mac and Lizzie McGuire was definitely a very nostalgic show. So I give you some props there. It's certainly not the most consistent by any means, but it's way better than what we've seen so far. And, I think overall the good outweighs the bad for 2001. So I'll give it at least a good tier there. Going into our next year, however, is 2002. This was also featured on Mike's list. This is now the fourth year that we've seen. And 2002 was at number 8 on his top 10. For me personally, that is definitely underselling 2002 because the big show that Mike really, really sells this year on is The Wire, which makes a lot of sense because The Wire very famously is often regarded as the best drama of all time, the best crime thriller of all time, and by some outlets, the best show of all time. It's one of Mike's favorites. Totally understand why he would sell an entire year just on the power of The Wire. But for me, not even mentioning American Idol is a damn travesty because American Idol, man, absolutely set the stage for so many reality shows, so many competition shows, the biggest show of the year as far as, the ratings are concerned, and a consistent 8-year run at number 1 is undefeated by any other show in TV history. Basically transformed not just the TV industry, but the music industry as well for years and potentially even decades to come. We're just now starting to see the power of what American Idol was capable of. But even outside of those two, you also have just a great supporting cast of dramas like CSI Miami, Firefly, The Shield, and Monk. A good, really good selection of sitcoms, man. The sitcoms from 2008, for some reason, get so overshadowed, but they're super underrated, man, especially 8 Simple Rules and What I Like About You. And those are 2 of my personal favorites. And then as well, George Lopez is great. Clone High as the animated sitcom from this year is amazing. And then Less Than Perfect with Sherry Shepherd as well is a lot of fun. So the sitcoms, man, never get enough attention because there's some really big names out of this one. Another great selection of animated series for the kids: Cyber Chase, Jimmy Neutron, Baby Looney Tunes, Kim Possible. I should just say Kim Possible. I meant to say Kim Possible, rather. Sorry about that. Max and Ruby and Chalk Zone, all great. And then a couple miscellaneous shows in here: Carson Daly, his late night talk show, and Dr. Phil. Obviously not really stuff that I think most people are that into nowadays, but they were super big back in the day. And then the infamous trash this year is The Bachelor, which transversely is not really as big as it once was because... And then the infamous trash for this year being The Bachelor here, which is definitely not a show that I'm really that big on, but I know a lot of people that still love it. It still brings in a lot of viewers every single year somehow, so I understand why ABC won't let go of it because it's still a ratings powerhouse, but for some reason, I'm just not really the biggest fan of it. But I gotta tell you, man, 2002, super, super overlooked year for TV, man. An absolute juggernaut on the back of American Idol, The Wire, those great sitcoms, those great animated series. There's really nothing to dislike in 2002, man. There's a lot of good stuff here. Very, very overlooked year. 2003, on the other hand, is not so great. I think that 2003 suffered from just kind of a lack of interest from people who wanted something kind of new, because I think a lot of these shows, a lot of the big shows from 2003, if you look at the year-end lists and such, were carryover from the early 2000s and even from the late 90s still. A lot of those shows still had a lot of power behind them. And then American Idol obviously was basically gatekeeping the number 1 spot from any show for almost a decade, like I just mentioned. So 2003, none of these shows really broke out the way that we had seen years prior. And that, I think, was really the sort of general reputation with a lot of these shows. Most of them, especially some of these sitcoms like Arrested Development or The Office UK, are huge as far as critical lists go, and you'll see them on the best shows of all time lists often, but they were not popular. And even, in retrospect, when they were brought back and such for different specials, or like when Netflix picked up Arrested Development, I mean, it was a pretty niche audience that was really gravitating towards them. So to say that they were like huge mainstream hits is not really accurate. Two and a Half Men was definitely the biggest show from this year as far as the comedies go, but that show has aged really badly in many, many ways. And then with the death of the character of Charlie following season 8 and bringing in Walden as the replacement there with Ashton Kutcher, that was not a very good lead at all, and that was not a good choice. And I know for me and for a lot of other people, that's when the show just got really, really bad and became really, really bottom of the barrel type material there at that point. The last season in particular, season 12, one of the worst reviewed seasons on all of TV, man, and the finale was a big, big disappointment to a lot of people. So that show just in general just has not aged well at all. Some of the dramas here as well were not very good. NCIS is the most popular, but it has definitely weaned as far as its popularity goes. It's been on for 20 years now, so you can expect that a lot of people are not tuning in the way that they once were. But even comparable to other shows that have been on for a very long time, like Grey's Anatomy or Special Victims Unit, I mean, those shows still pull in really big numbers. NCIS, I mean, it's dropped to like 3 million, 3 or 4 million viewers an episode now compared to the heights where it once was at like 20 million. So that's pretty insane. One Tree Hill here, another drama that I have just no interest in watching whatsoever. It combines two of my least favorite subgenres of any drama type of series, which are romance and sports. I talked about earlier, I'm not really a sports guy, and romance is, not really my thing either. So if you like one or both of those, I'm sure it's going to hit for you. But for me, it just looks like a bad teen drama. The OC is another one where, practically that show just kind of shot itself in the foot with the very infamous shooting scene. Again, if you know, you know. So that show hasn't aged well. Some of these sketch comedy shows and these talk shows as well at the bottom, like the Ali G Show and Jimmy Kimmel Live, Ellen DeGeneres, again, another example there of just stuff not aging well. That's kind of just the theme for this year, man. Just not aged well. None of this stuff is really that big nowadays. Even That's So Raven, too, another sitcom that I forgot to mention with Orlando Brown and all his fucking antics and shit. Like, God, is there anything that has aged well on this fucking list, man? The Berenstain Bears, I guess. That's probably the best show on this entire list. But yeah, 2003 was a tough year, man, for TV because just so many issues plaguing a lot of these shows. I don't think it was the worst overall, but it was a bit of a mess. So we can't put it any higher than Matt here. Just not a very good selection overall. 2004, on the other hand, this was a pretty solid year for TV. A lot of big dramas this year for sure. Lost, Veronica Mars, Battlestar Galactica, House, Deadwood, all those are really, really solid. Maybe not all, will hit for everybody. Definitely a lot more niche stuff in here. Desperate Housewives, one of my least favorite of all time, so definitely won't see me watching that show anytime soon. But, in their own right, they were all very popular. The Apprentice, Biggest Loser, and Project Runway you have for, sort of these competition shows again. I was pretty into The Biggest Loser back in the day. Never really cared for The Apprentice or Project Runway all that much. The Apprentice, of course, with Donald Trump as the host, most infamously. So it's kind of another example of some of that not aging all that well. But Biggest Loser, is okay out of those. The three sitcoms you have from this year, Drake and Josh and Ned's Declassified, easily, two of the best that Nickelodeon ever did. That's definitely going to raise 2004 up in the rankings for me. And then Entourage on HBO was very popular back in the day, had the movie just a few years ago as well. Danny Phantom, Foster's Home, and Postcards from Buster for your animated series, not too bad. And then Chef at Home as one of my personal favorite cooking shows from this year. So overall, 2004, not a terrible year by any means. Some of it, a little iffy here and there, but I would say a pretty good year, all things considered. When we look at 2005, however, this is a pretty baller year, I must say. This is a pretty great year for TV. Another one that was featured in Mike's video. If you know anything about Mike, you will know that two of his all-time favorite sitcoms, period, the only two sitcoms, I believe, that appear in his top 10 favorite shows, How I Met Your Mother and The Office, both came out in 2005. So is it any wonder to you that based on those two alone, as well as Prison Break, which is also in his top 3 favorite shows ever, all came out the same year, that this was the one that topped his top 10 years video. 2005 is Mike's favorite year for TV. And honestly, I'm not going to debate you on that because it's a great year for television. How I Met Your Mother, The Office, Everybody Hates Chris, Zack and Cody, Always Sunny in Philadelphia, Zoe 101, My Name is Earl. Huge selection of sitcoms. Even if not all of them personally hit on the same rung for me. The Office, It's Always Sunny, and Zoe 101 I've talked about in the past. Not really the biggest fan of, but I can respect those for being as influential as they are. For the dramas, you have Grey's Anatomy, Prison Break, Supernatural, Criminal Minds, Ghost Whisperer, Law & Order, Trial by Jury, Bones, and Weeds in there. I mean, those are all fucking fantastic shows in their own right. Definitely Prison Break, probably my favorite of those. I totally agree with Mike, man. That is a stellar drama. For the animated shows, Robot Dad, Jesus Christ. For the animated shows, you have stuff like American Dad, Robot Chicken, Avatar: The Last Airbender, Johnny Test, The Boondocks, and Moral Orel. A lot of big animated adult cartoons in this one, especially. This was a big year for Adult Swim, you can see, with stuff like The Boondocks here. Adult Swim really had a good year for 2005, especially the mid to late 2000s was really their year that they really broke out into the mainstream for, which was great. And then for the cooking shows as well, a very, very overlooked category for this year with Hell's Kitchen, Iron Chef America, and the F Word to boot here. 3 of the biggest in their respective categories that are all going very strong to this day. That started a decade and a half ago. So yeah, no surprise to me that 2005 ranks as high for Mike as it does for just about everybody else who appreciates great TV. I'm going to put it up there in A1 tier, man. It's pretty undeniable. I mean, obviously, you guys know How I Met Your Mother. That alone would pretty much secure a year in at least the great tier, even if everything else was horrible. Even if How I Met Your Mother and Drew Carey came out the same year, I think How I Met Your Mother would overall trump it there. But yeah, with the assortment of great supporting shows behind it, 2005 is absolutely incredible. Unfortunately, the pattern persists where we go from a great year to a pretty mediocre one. And in this case, it's 2005 into 2006, 2006 being a pretty dreadful year for TV. So let's break it down. We got Curious George, Fetch with Rough Ruffman, Wonder Pets, Wow Wow Wubsy. Those 4, hugely nostalgic for me. Totally personal. I totally understand if like some of those just do not hit the same for you. If you're a little bit older or a little bit younger, it's going to be a totally different assortment of shows that were nostalgic to you. But those 4 were childhood favorites for me. But after that, you have Metalocalypse, which I never really got into despite being, a music type show. That was another Adult Swim show, so another example of them really breaking out this year. And then VeggieTales, which I think is pretty infamous, pretty bad. That's another one that, it's a religious type show. It's, Christian show, so you can feel how you want about it. I'm not going to, completely, you can feel how you want about it if, that was a big part of your childhood. I can understand it, but for me, always avoided it. Was never really, anything that me and Matt really enjoyed watching as kids. When it came to the dramas, a little bit inconsistent here, a little bit all over the place. Dexter, definitely the most famous of all these, but depending on who you ask, maybe not the best. Its reputation has definitely soured for a lot of people with the last episode and kind of the infamous 8th season of the show just kind of not being very good is really as simple as that. And then with the revival New Blood that came out last year, and the kind of dreadful ending that had as well. A lot of people soured on that too. So Dexter, one of those franchises that just hasn't had the best luck at really sustaining itself as much as it should have been able to, given its hype in the earlier seasons. Friday Night Lights, probably my favorite personally of all of these shows. That's a really, really good sports drama. I said earlier, not really into sports, but that's, really the one exception. I feel like Ugly Betty, I never understood the appeal for. I thought that show was really, really not good. America Ferrera, I've never been a fan of her pretty much ever. So any of her shows that she's done, I think she's pretty overrated as an actress. So that's never really been, my cup of tea whatsoever. And then Psych there to round it out. I've never seen it, so I can't really say, but it was pretty popular. So like I said, that one, it's a little bit all over the place. It's a little more hit or miss. When it came to some of the competition game show type stuff, you have America's Got Talent, which is huge. But again, depending on who you ask, a lot of people say it's really, really amazing. A lot of people say it's really, really bad. It just kind of depends on how you feel about those types of shows. 1 vs. 100, which was very underrated with Bob Saget as the host, rest in peace. Identity with Penn Jillette as the host, another pretty underrated show. And then Yo Mama on MTV once again. We see MTV cropping up here with Wilmer Valderrama from that 70s show as the host there. So pretty interesting assortment there. And then you come to the sitcoms, which I hate to, be that guy, the down, right. But then after all that, you come to the sitcoms here, which I hate to be, a Debbie Downer here, but the sitcoms for 2006 really pull this one down to one of the weakest years for TV, especially in the 2000s. The New Adventures of Old Christine, that's easily the best out of the ones that we have here. I don't think it's a bad show by any means, but it's pretty, forgettable. It's really not one of those shows that's had any sustaining popularity, despite having Julia Louis-Dreyfus in the lead role. It's just kind of become a pretty mediocre show for her, even though it is way better, in my opinion, at least, to 30 Rock. I think 30 Rock is terribly overrated. It's just not very good at all, despite, again, the cast being really good, Alec Baldwin, Tina Fey, but yeah, the actual execution of the story and stuff is pretty dreadful. And then Lucky Louie here as easily the worst show on this entire year. Oh man, Lucky Louie. Well, for one, if you know Louis C.K. and all of his fucking bullshit with the Me Too stuff, he's another example of someone who has just a really bad reputation as a person. So it's kind of, come back to bite him in the ass with a lot of his shows. And this was his first major sitcom that he did for HBO back in the day, where there is a scene where, kid you not, he fucking flashes his dick and balls on TV. You see it. You see his fucking dick. You see Louis C.K. dick, and it's not pretty. And what's weird is, the show itself is multicam, and it has a laugh track, and there was an in-person audience. So that means that when they shot it, Louis C.K. flashed his dick and balls to not just the people working on the show, but the poor audience members that had to be there for that episode's taping. I hope those people are okay, and if they need therapy, man, I will personally pay for it because I feel like I needed it after watching the clip 15 years later. It was not very pretty at all, man. Get the fuck out of here with that shit. Lucky Louie, absolute trash. But not even the worst show again that we have here, because in this case, it's going to be Happy Tree Friends, which I was talking to Matt about this one. Matt absolutely hates this show. He's the cartoon expert. He's the animated expert here, and he will tell you that alongside Angela Anaconda, this is one of the worst animated shows ever made. So had to throw it in the infamous trash title there. But yeah, 2006 as a whole, man, was all over the place. A couple good shows here, again, depending on who you ask. This is honestly borderline in the bad tier. I'm going to put it up in the meh tier because I think there is some good stuff. There is some salvageable stuff here. The early seasons of Dexter, Friday Night Lights, 1 vs. 100, Curious George. I think those are all pretty solid. But between 30 Rock, Lucky Louie, fucking Ugly Betty, VeggieTales, Happy Tree Friends. I mean, there's a lot of bad stuff that really pulls it down. So 2006, very, very debatable, but not good. Following that, though, 2007 here. Bring us back up to the positivity. That's what we're all about here, man. Let's get out of our Debbie Downer sort of attitudes here and celebrate, because 2007 is easily one of the best years for TV. And believe it or not, was not included on Mike's list. Mike, if you're watching this, man, I love you, and I love your content, and your videos, and I respect your opinion, but man, why the hell was 2007 absent from your list? Easily the biggest snub off of Mike's video. The sitcoms this year, absolute gold standard. The Big Bang Theory, iCarly, Rules of Engagement, Wizards of Waverly Place, Cory in the House, House of Pain, The Class, and Aliens in America. Those final two ones only on for a single season, but super, super big cult followings there, myself included. The Class, man, one of the best casts ever put together. A pre-Walking Dead John Bernthal, a pre-Modern Family Jesse Tyler Ferguson, and Jason Ritter, son of the legendary great John Ritter, as we've been referencing here. It's an absolutely wonderful show, and you can find it online on Dailymotion, all for free. So I highly recommend it there. But yeah, I mean, that batch of sitcoms is unmatched, man. The Big Bang Theory leading the pack there, easily one of the best out there. iCarly, my favorite Dan Schneider show ever. Rules of Engagement, super underrated. Wizards of Waverly Place, probably my favorite Disney Channel show ever. So two back-to-back there for the kids sitcoms. I mean, that is just an amazing, amazing assortment of comedies. Let's move on to the cooking shows this year. A huge assortment there. Dinner Impossible, my favorite cooking show of all time. Like, not even a competition, man. My favorite, period. Robert Irvine, what an absolute legend there. Some of those episodes, I shit you not, I've seen probably upwards of like 100 times. Like, I'm not even exaggerating, because many of them are online for free, and I watched those all the time as a kid. I could quote you from front to back the Six Flags episode. I think I could. The entire thing. I've seen it that much. Kitchen Nightmares, probably Gordon Ramsay's most famous show. I wouldn't say his best, but I could see why a lot of people think it is. I think it is Matt's favorite of all the ones that he has, so I could totally understand why. Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives, great show, super comforting with Guy Fieri. And then Bizarre Foods, a super underrated show from the Travel Channel with Andrew Zimmer as the host there. Very, very good. For the cartoons this year, we had another great selection. Phineas and Ferb, Super Y, Word World, Word Girl, Chowder, Total Drama, Death Note, and The Nut Shack. Many of those super nostalgic for me, whether on Cartoon Network or PBS Kids, really the standout networks this year. And then as we come to the dramas as well, quality over quantity with the dramas, man. Mad Men, I mean, needs no introduction. Jon Hamm, of course, is Don Draper. Absolutely amazing performance. Californication, you got the legendary David Duchovny as Hank Moody here. This has been one of Matt's favorites recently, so he's definitely been hyping this up, and it totally earns its reputation, man. It's a really good drama, really funny, but it can be very emotional at times, perfectly balanced. And then a Private Practice here, which I don't think is as strong as those, but it was the spinoff to Grey's Anatomy, and it was super successful. So, I mean, Grey's Anatomy, can't say anything bad about that, of course. Huge, huge medical drama, and it got a spinoff. And then to top it all off, man, The Whitest Kids You Know, megaly, I don't even know if that's a word, mega over. And then to top it off here, we have The Whitest Kids You Know, easily one of the most overlooked and underappreciated sketch comedy shows ever. Rest in peace, Trevor Moore, man. Absolute loss there. Super, super funny guy, man. Just absolutely amazing. So, yeah, 2007 here. I mean, not really a weak show in this entire batch, aside from maybe Private Practice, like I said. I mean, that might be the weakest. Keeping Up with the Kardashians as the worst show, as the infamous trash show this year. Here's the thing, man. I understand why a lot of people don't like this show. I'm not really a big fan of it, but you got to give it its flowers because the Kardashians are fucking popular as hell. They have a cult-like status. People watch anything they're in. This show was on for 10 years, and it was one of the highest rated that E ever had. And it was so big that when it was canceled, they instantly got another show on fucking Hulu, one of the biggest streamers of all time there. And that show is arguably bigger than this one. That's how big they are even, 15 years later after their debut. So say what you will about them, but they fucking earned their fucking success because people love that shit. But yeah, 2007, I mean, there is no denying here that this is easily one of the best years. Like I said, I think a major snub off of Mike's top 10. I really, really was shocked when going back in it and seeing all these great shows that wasn't featured on there. But yeah, absolutely fantastic stuff. Unfortunately, now we have to talk about 2008, the year following it, which, again, I don't think was really as strong. This one, interestingly, was featured on Mike's list, which is understandable. When you take a look at some of these dramas here, this is really the strongest aspect that Mike sells you on with this particular year, with Breaking Bad, of course, as the leader. Breaking Bad is Breaking Bad. I mean, no one doesn't know Breaking Bad. Everyone has seen it. Everyone loves Breaking Bad. So, totally understand why that is going to be a huge, huge selling point for putting this in the top 10, as well as Sons of Anarchy, which I'm not really that big on personally, but Mike has a huge, huge, huge love for it. So, again, based on the success of those two, it's pretty easy to see why 2008 would be up there. But when you take a look at everything else around it, this was a pretty weak year for every other genre aside from dramas. Cooking shows, I think, honestly, are the best genre this year, with stuff like Man vs. Food, Cook's Country, Primal Grill, Giada at Home, Sarah's Weeknight Meals, Fresh with Anna Olson, Anna and Christina. I love all those shows, but none of those have, any sort of mainstream appeal, right? And I understand that. So it's hard to justify when the biggest genre is something like a cooking show or a game show, because it just doesn't hold the same weight as like a drama or a comedy does. So that's kind of the issue there. Some of the other dramas, they were big, but they weren't, Breaking Bad level big. It was stuff like Fringe and True Blood and The Mentalist, Lipstick Jungle, they were there. You could watch them, but I don't think anyone really talks about them much nowadays. So they're kind of just forgotten about by now. The animated shows this year were kind of weak. Penguins Madagascar, the biggest of them, wasn't really ever a fan of the Madagascar movies, so didn't really feel like it was that appealing to make a show out of it. The one that I actually remember most fondly about these is Sid the Science Kid, but I don't think that's aged very well. And then you got just the stupid fucking, game shows this year, like Wipeout and My Family's Got Guts and I Survived a Japanese Game Show, which, based on the title alone, you can already tell is not aged well. And then these really bad talk shows like Rachel Maddow and Wendy Williams, which recently ended this year, timely, so that's pretty interesting. And then The Doctors as well, which was a morning talk show all about medicine and what your shit looks like and how to fucking, how to eat so that you can shit more if you're constipated. Stupid fucking idea for a show. The infamous trash, The Real Housewives of series started this year, which is very similar to like Kardashian, right? Where it's just bullshit reality TV. That's a huge fucking franchise. And again, you can give it its props for being super popular and such, but obviously, objectively, it's not very good TV. So 2008, man, yeah, it has Breaking Bad. I will give that to you. It has Breaking Bad. But what else does it have? Not very much. So we're going to give it a meh tier. You can maybe squeeze it into the good tier at least for Breaking Bad, but I don't know, man. Everything else around it is just pretty weak overall. All right. The next year as well, 2009. This is going to be controversial. I can already tell you. This is probably going to be the most controversial year that we're going to talk about in this video, because this also is very heavily featured on Mike's list. We already saw his number 1. We already saw his number 3. So what was runner-up on Mike's top 10? Well, as it turns out, it was 2009. And again, Mike sells this very well. 3 powerhouse comedies rather, that he really, really pushes hard as the reasons why this year is as good as it is, in the form of Modern Family, Parks and Rec, and Community. And of those 3, I agree with 2 of them. Modern Family and Parks and Rec are outstanding. Modern Family is my second favorite show ever, behind How I Met Your Mother, so obviously it's going to win big points with me. But Community, I do find to be pretty overrated, as do I feel like the majority of the other sitcoms from this year are. Cougar Town, The League, The Cleveland Show, Archer, Glenn Martin DDS, whether it was live action or animated, kind of, a little bit hit or miss for me overall, and nothing that's really lasted all these years later. Big Time Rush, I think, was one of the stronger ones this year, but it definitely did not have the same appeal as like an iCarly. It was always kind of second fiddle to the Dan Schneider stuff. And then Majority Rules there on the end, which I really like, but again, objectively, reputation it has is really bad, and it's very, very obscure, so it doesn't really hold a lot of weight for other people. For the second biggest genre this year, again, we talked about just a minute ago that if it's not going to be a drama or an animated series, it's going to be one of these more niche ones. The year as a whole just doesn't have as much staying power, and in this case, it's again these late night shows. Late Night with Jimmy Fallon, Tonight Show with Conan O'Brien, Jay Leno Show, Tosh.0, Watch What Happens Live, Lopez Tonight. There were so fucking many of these. In years prior, we've seen, maybe 2 or 3 big late night shows, and that's a fair amount to have. But when there's like 6, and those are the most popular of the year, that's not a very good sign, As far as the dramas that came out in 2009, again, most of these I feel like are pretty forgotten at this point. The Good Wife, The Vampire Diaries, one of the most infamous CW shows, NCIS LA, which I love, hardcore NCIS fans don't like. Take that as you will. Glee, pretty self-explanatory. Royal Pains, medical show. Castle, pretty average police procedural with Nathan Fillion. And The Listener, Canadian show that was brought over to Ion. Not a very impressive list, to be honest with you. Maybe, NCIS LA, it's still on to this day, so I'll give you that, and I do like it. But, The Good Wife, I don't know. It doesn't really have a huge reputation. The Vampire Diaries, like I said, it's kind of just there. Royal Pains, it's a medical show, that's not really going to appeal to me. So, I don't know. It's a pretty unremarkable list, to tell you the truth. And then the more miscellaneous stuff we have is Shark Tank and American Ninja Warrior, which I do like those shows, but again, they just don't have a lot of, they don't hold a lot of weight in comparison to it. Little to no animated shows outside of those ones that we saw in the sitcoms there. So it's like the Cleveland Show, Archer, and Glenn Martin. None of those are really hold any staying power. But the real catalyst for 2009, and the reason why I think this is absurd to put as the second best year for TV, is because of the infamous trash label. Every year prior to this and every year past this, we're only going to see one. I promised myself I wouldn't divulge into this. I wouldn't go over one. But with 2009, I couldn't resist it because 3 of the absolute worst shows that I've ever seen in 3 different categories that are all just terrible. Jersey Shore, one of the worst reality shows ever. I'd honestly take The Real Housewives and The Kardashians over Jersey Shore. The Middle, one of the absolute worst sitcoms ever made. One of the absolute worst, man. Just a poor man's Malcolm in the Middle is really the best I could, and the most positive thing I can say about it. And then Fanboy and Chum Chum to end this year on a really, really bad note, because everyone knows, especially if you grew up in the 2000s like I did, that Fanboy and Chum Chum was pretty inescapable, and how absolutely torturous that was to live in a world with Fanboy and Chum Chum as one of the most popular animated series. Pretty bad. I don't think it's debatable that 2009 was not a good year for TV. And again, I urge you, if you look at this list and you think it's the second greatest year for TV, you must be smoking crack, man. I love you, bro. I love you, Mike. And I respect your opinion, but I do not agree with you, man. 2009 was a bad year for TV. 2010, on the other hand, was a fantastic year for TV. This was an amazing year for TV. Right off the bat here, The Walking Dead, Mike and Molly, Regular Show, and MasterChef. Those 4 that you see as the leaders in their respective genres once again. All 4 of those, A1 top tier shows of all time for me. Walking Dead, top 3 dramas ever. Mike and Molly, top 3 sitcom ever. Regular Show, top 3 animated show ever. MasterChef, top 3 competition show ever. Undeniable. Off of the power of those 4 alone, this is easily A1 tier, borderline God tier, honestly, for me. Everything else around it is kind of hit or miss. There's some big dramas in here, and there's some other, couple decent sitcoms like Victorious is in here, but, obviously the later seasons kind of, put it on a different level. You have stuff in here like another Scooby-Doo show, which I do like. Cat in the Hat, pretty nostalgic. Worst Cooks in America is okay as far as the cooking shows go, but really for me, off the power of those main four, Walking Dead, Mike and Molly, regular show, and MasterChef, those are really the catalyst here for me. I think 2010 deserves an A1 tier. It is probably the weakest of all of these, I will say, and you'll see that in the final ranking, but I will say that 2010 overall was just a much more consistent year than 2009, where it was just really all over the place, as we just talked about. 2011 here, this was featured on Mike's list. This was actually number 4 on Mike's list, so this was pretty high as well. And obviously off the back of Game of Thrones, right, is obviously going to be the big show that everyone is invested in from this year, which makes sense. I do like Game of Thrones myself. I haven't seen as much of it as most people, so I can't really, say on the later seasons, but I do like some of the first couple of episodes, and the, of course, the finale here is kind of what's going to, be a little more. We're gonna redo it. Okay. Whatever. All right. Going into 2011 here, this was also featured on Mike's list. This was number 4 on Mike's list, so pretty high up there. And I think this was a pretty great year for TV. I definitely agree that this is top 10 worthy, depending on the person there. And I think based on Mike's appreciation for TV, I can see why this would be up there for him. Game of Thrones obviously being the big show that really sells this year for him and for most people. I do like Game of Thrones. I've seen the very first episode and I did enjoy it, but I haven't seen those later seasons that I know a lot of people hate, or at least the last season at least, with the infamous finale, so I can't judge those. But my personal favorite drama from this year has to be Black Mirror. Black Mirror is phenomenal, man. It's just a better, more advanced version of The Twilight Zone. If you like The Twilight Zone, if you like anthology shows in general, and you like the sci-fi, kind of futuristic type of series, then Black Mirror is going to be right up your alley. Aside from that, Person of Interest, Revenge, American Horror Story, Teen Wolf in their suits. There's a good amount of dramas in here. But for me, the comedy this year really stands out. You have a great assortment of comedy, super, super good amount of variety in every single subtext and subgenre within the comedy space. If you want a great traditional live action sitcom, we got Two Broke Girls for you. We got Last Man Standing for you. Those are awesome choices. If you want a more, single cam sitcom with a voiceover, you got Suburgatory in there, very underrated. If you want a great animated type of series, we got Bob's Burgers for you. If you want a great sketch comedy show, we got Portlandia for you. And if you want a great hidden camera sort of prank type show, we got Impractical Jokers for you. A huge fan favorite that I'm definitely a big fan of myself. Outside of that, some more miscellaneous stuff. You got like The Voice in there. Bar Rescue is really fun. Penn and Teller Fool Us, I've talked about. I'm a fan of that show. The infamous trash this year, Downton Abbey. Definitely not recommend that at all. Is definitely one of the weaker weaker dramas rather. But everything else from this year I think is pretty strong. This is a very, very good year for TV. And like I said, depending on the person, I think that this is easily a top 10 worthy year for this debate. So great year, great tier is where it's going to go. All right, moving into 2012 here. 2012 was an all right year for TV. It definitely wasn't as big as far as the amount of shows, again, that we got. The quantity is a little smaller here, but the quality of shows, I think, make up for it. You got three really strong ones in the form of Veep, Gravity Falls, and Chicago Fire. I do believe that those are the strongest from this year. The comedies as a whole, I think, were pretty good. You got Anger Management in there, The Neighbors, which is pretty underrated, Mindy Project, which was popular. Mindy Kaling, of course, kind of made her breakthrough on The Office and then got a show of her own, and Don't Trust the Bee in Apartment 23, which is often cited as a great show that was canceled too early. Again, kind of has that mantra to it. For the animated stuff, Gravity Falls obviously really the leader in this pack, but you also have Brickleberry, Legend of Korra, Napoleon Dynamite, the TV show adaptation that was, not reviewed the best, but it's kind of fun to look back on if you're a fan of the movie. Scandal and Chicago Fire, like I said, really leading for the dramas there. And then Arrow, Nashville, and Elementary, I think, are all pretty strong. And then, again, some, more obscure but pretty solid and underrated cooking shows with My Family Recipe Rocks, Mystery Diners, and You Gotta Eat Here. So, all in all, 2012, not the most variety-packed year ever, and definitely not the most amount of shows, definitely not compared to some of the other ones we just saw, which had the whole slide filled, but I would say a pretty solid year overall. I think a good tier is fair. The big kind of infamous show this year was Duck Dynasty. I feel like that show was pretty infamous of the time, but of all the ones that we've talked about, like, that one hasn't really stayed as like in the public eye. Like, it's not really as relevant anymore. That was more of a phase. So you can even just, kind of write that one off as like, it was bad, but, it hasn't stuck around, thankfully. So you can kind of look at that as a bit of a positive from 2012. 2013 here, this was a good year for TV, man. 2013, very, very underrated year for TV. The dramas here obviously are going to be the most prominent, but honestly, I think almost every other category is, in my eyes, better than the dramas here, because the dramas have some stuff like House of Cards and Hannibal and, The Blacklist that I think are all kind of overrated, but there's some pretty underrated stuff in here too. The Americans is phenomenal, man. Definitely worth checking out if you like sort of the spy stuff, the thriller type shows, action shows. You're definitely going to like that. Orange is the New Black is great, super funny. Bates Motel is really good. That's definitely one that I want to see some more of. Kind of been, slowly but surely getting into that one a little bit. And then Siberia as well, super underrated, and one of my favorite sci-fi shows ever. And Banshee, very underrated as well. That was one that Mike introduced me to. So good assortment of dramas here. For the cooking shows, once again, you have Cutthroat Kitchen, The Taste, MasterChef Junior, Beat Bobby Flay, Food Factory. Those are all really strong. Animated shows, definitely the biggest of them is Rick and Morty, which, again, I'm not really, the biggest fan of. I've never really been big Dan Harmon guy. So as I talked about earlier, Community, is not really my cup of tea, but I can see if you, like Community, then you'll definitely like Rick and Morty. If you like Rick and Morty, you'll probably like Community. There you go. It's just his, type of comedy there, which if you vibe with, you're going to like a lot of his stuff. But everything else around it, I think, is honestly pretty good. Steven Universe, Peg and Cat, Axe Cop, Paw Patrol, Uncle Grandpa, Teen Titans Go. Some stuff in there that maybe hasn't aged the best, but was certainly very notable for when it came out. Axe Cop's super underrated. That's definitely my favorite out of those. And then for the sitcoms here, super great selection. Again, going in the quality over quantity direction with the Goldbergs, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and Mom. Man, those are great, great series. Mom, another Chuck Lorre show, so huge one there. And Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Michael Schur, so can't go wrong there. The Infamous Trash with Sam and Cat, easily the worst show on this entire list there. But really ignoring that one, 2013 was a pretty phenomenal year, so I'm going to put it in the great tier as well. Really the lack of maybe variety a little bit here. No real game shows this year. That's kind of disappointing, but everything else around it, thumbs up for me. 2014 here, pretty similar year in terms of the quality that we got and sort of the selection is concerned, with dramas really leading the pack with this one. Chicago PD, easily being my favorite of the bunch. True Detective, Gotham, How to Get Away with Murder, NCIS New Orleans, Scorpion, Fargo, The 100, Jane the Virgin, The Leftovers, and The Night Shift. all rounding out a good assortment of dramas there. The second biggest category, once again, the late night shows, which this time around I think is pretty strong because there's not a huge amount of them like we saw earlier in 2009. There's just 3 really solid ones here from very reputable hosts that are all on to this day that are really strong in this category. If you ask anybody what are the best late night shows right now, these are 3 that you'll hear the most often responded to the highest quality ones, which are The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, Late Night with Seth Meyers, and my personal favorite, Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. The sitcoms this year, again, quality over quantity. You got Blackish, Young and Hungry, Silicon Valley, and Undateable. A couple of those I think are very, very underrated. Young and Hungry, man, is a great show that just did not get the love that it deserves. Undateable is really funny as well. Silicon Valley is one of HBO's most overlooked. So if you want some good sitcoms, those are some good options there. And then rounding out with the cartoons here, we have Clarence, BoJack Horseman, Over the Garden Wall, and Mr. Pickles. A nice variety between the adult and the kids animation as well. But again, we got to talk about the infamous trash here, and this is a big one. This is definitely going to ding it quite a bit here with Henry Danger. Honestly, if it wasn't for Henry Danger, I think that this could go in the A1 tier, but we're going to knock it back a little bit because Henry Danger is just awful. I mean, next to Drew Carey, it's probably my least favorite show of all time. So we can't put it up too high, but man, it is just on the brink of it. It is right on the border of getting into that A1 tier. Really, really good assortment of shows. But man, fucking Henry Danger, man, just had to come in and just fucking screw it up, man. Just pull the rug underneath. But that's all right, man. 2014 is still a really good year. 2015 here, I would say this is a pretty solid year for TV. The biggest issue that I have with it personally is I'm just not that familiar with most of these shows, like the big dramas this year. This is probably the one, year of the recent 2010s assortments that I just haven't seen a lot of these dramas. So stuff like Empire, I've never watched. I've never seen Ballers. I've never seen Mr. Robot. I've never seen Supergirl. So for like those, I can't judge. Quantico, I've never watched. There are some of my personal favorites in here, like American Crime is awesome and super underrated. Blind Spot, very nostalgic for me. Chicago Med is my favorite medical show of all time, so that's in here. But most of those other ones, I just haven't seen that much of. Better Call Saul is easily the biggest one from this year and really the main catalyst to put it on Mike's list again. This was at number 9. The sitcoms here were very hit or miss. Like, there's some good stuff in here and there's some really bad stuff in here. I would say my favorite of all of them is probably Last Man on Earth there, but I also like Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll. Game Shakers is good. Carmichael Show is pretty underrated, but stuff like Superstore is very overrated. Not a fan of Schitt's Creek at all. Fresh Off the Boat is extremely hit or miss. Probably one of the biggest examples of the first season being really good and then having that huge sophomore slump into season 2. Season 2 onward is really bad at times, man. It gets really, really bad. But season 1 was good, so it's just kind of inconsistent. And then Life in Pieces as well is in there. That was a big show. The late night shows this time around, I was not really a fan of. Stephen Colbert, I think is pretty overrated, to be honest with you. James Corden, I think, is very overrated. And then Best Time Ever with Neil Patrick Harris is a primetime variety show. Just hasn't really aged all that well, simply. And then the animated shows to round us out here: Star vs. F is for Family, and One Punch Man. I've never seen F is for Family or One Punch Man, but I know that those are pretty big in the animation scene, and Star vs. is good, so I'll give you that one. Pickle and Peanut is another animated show that's the infamous trash. Can't say that it's all that good. Matt will cite it as one of the worst as well, so I trust him more with the animated stuff than I would know myself. So overall, 2015, I'll say it's a good tier. It's probably the lowest that, of all the ones that are featured on Mike's list, it's the one that I can understand why it's on there, but it's the least, impressive one, I guess you could say. And I don't really know how to explain it, but, I can see why he would put it on there, because a lot of the shows he likes more than me. But, for me personally, most of those are just kind of overrated. 2016, on the other hand, was also featured on his list at number 10. So those are, really close. And he does say you could flip those hypothetically. I think 2016 is a bit better because it more prominently features sitcoms, which I like more than dramas generally. And this year had a good batch of them. You had The Good Place, American Housewife, Kevin Can Wait, Man with a Plan, Angie Tribeca, Speechless, Vice Principals, Atlanta. Those are all pretty good. With the drama Stranger Things, easily the biggest of these, man, like without question. As I filmed this, Volume 2 just came out like not even a week ago, so a lot of people talking about that right now, just absolutely everywhere in TV, subreddits and on Twitter and everything. Can't avoid Stranger Things now, so that's a huge show. This Is Us, which just recently ended earlier this year, just about a month ago, with its finale, which was another huge show that was pretty unescapable for a little while. Designated Survivor, probably my favorite of all the dramas out of this batch. Lucifer, which was pretty good. Bull, The Crown, Legends of Tomorrow, Vinyl, and Shades of Blue. Pretty solid selection. And then the animated shows to finish: Loud House, Border Town, and Ready, Jet, Go. The infamous trash this year, another sitcom, this one a Nickelodeon one that was an adaptation of School of Rock, which don't understand why that was necessary, don't understand the appeal to it, because the movie is just so good. So yeah, not really a show that too many people were into, but again, outside of that, I think 2016 was a pretty great year. A lot of those sitcoms really, really carrying the mantle here. For 2017, on the other hand, this is definitely the weakest year for any of the 2010s. 2010s in general, a lot of people would argue that they're the golden age of TV, and I would agree with that, but 2017 was a pretty mediocre year. This was just kind of a boring year. There really isn't all that much to really, shine from this year. It was all just kind of there. The big four that really stand out to me out of this batch are all dramas, and they're the first four you see there: 13 Reasons Why, Ozark, The Good Doctor, and Riverdale. I think those are, pretty undeniably the biggest and the most notable four that came out this year. And all of them in their own right have good and bad aspects to them, and they're very polarizing. Those are four of the most polarizing shows I've ever seen. 13 Reasons Why, easily the biggest of them, because the first season is phenomenal, but even then, you had a lot of people who were not a fan of the subject matter, not a fan of how the show approached really sensitive and controversial topics. You had a lot of people that were just really, refused to watch the show. They, were just too sensitive about it, which is understandable given the themes of it. It was just a lot of, controversial opinions that spawned around that show. And then once season 2 came out, the quality dipped so much that it basically just started trumping the good that it did. And the last 3 seasons definitely overshadowed the good of season 1 for most people. So now it's kind of looked at as one of the weaker shows from this era of TV. Ozark, which is one of my favorites, I just started watching not too long ago. But again, I've heard people say that it's not very good for a crime drama. It's kind of mediocre. I would disagree with that. I think it's pretty solid, and I really like Jason Bateman in it. But, from huge hardcore crime drama fans, I have heard that there is a lot of other better options out there. So, you can make do with that however you want. The Good Doctor there, it's a medical drama, so naturally it's going to have a lot of people that are just not very into it. I like the show personally. I think it's one of the better ones out there, but some of the later seasons I wasn't really a fan of, and again, with the subject matter in it, with the lead character Sean having autism, there's some sensitivity there, and a lot of people don't like how that is portrayed, so it's another kind of controversial one. And then Riverdale kind of speaks for itself on how kind of over the top and crazy it's gotten. Again, that's another example where like season 1 is good, a lot of people would argue, and then it just completely got overshadowed by its later seasons, and now it's a complete mess of a show that is really hard to follow. So Riverdale, I've never really been a fan of it, but that's Riverdale for you. So those are the main dramas. There's a few more out there, like Handmaid's Tale and Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, SWAT, and are just kind of doing their thing. But those are really the most notable four. The comedies this year, I think, are a mess, man. There's some good stuff, but most of it, again, is pretty mediocre. Young Sheldon sucks. Never been a fan of it myself. Friends from College is super hit or miss. Some episodes are great, some episodes are terrible. The Orville, I've never really watched, so I can't say. Big Mouth is awesome. I love Big Mouth, but there's so many people that just hate it and like cannot stand it at all. So it's kind of the same thing as like Riverdale or 13 Reasons. I was just saying, like so many people that just absolutely refuse to watch it. The Real Bros of Simi Valley, I think, is awesome again, but it's really obscure. And then same thing with Special Skills. Those two are great and probably my favorites on the entire list, but they're just not super popular. So again, they just don't hold as much weight. And then the game shows to finish: Beat Shazam, World of Dance, and Ellen's Game of Games. Ellen's show again hasn't aged well. Beat Shazam, a lot of people hate it. my brother and my dad hate it for some reason. I like it, but again, it has that sort of you love it or hate it sort of mantra to it. And then World of Dance is your typical dancing competition, which is just pretty oversaturated as a market. The infamous trash 90 Day Fiancé, the spinoff there, which is just more reality show kind of BS there. So 2017 as a whole is another one that's a bit of a mess. It does have some salvageable parts, so I wouldn't put it like completely in the bad tier, but it's definitely closer to the more mediocre average side of things. The best shows overall are just kind of overshadowed by their later seasons or just the amount of people that just refuse to watch them that kind of give them a bit of more of a negative reputation, I would say. All right, moving into 2018 here. Now, this, on the other hand, was a fantastic year for TV, especially with these dramas once again. The dramas here are in a league of their own, man, because those top three that you see there all were the grounds to start major franchises that are some of the biggest currently on network TV for their respective channels. You have All American on the CW, you have FBI on CBS, and you have 911 on Fox there. I really, really appreciate and respect a ton of what they're doing. FBI and 911 are some of my favorites personally, so really, really dig those each week. But that's just, again, the tip of the iceberg here, because after that you have stuff like Good Girls and Manifest and Mayans MC, Station 19, Cobra Kai, New Amsterdam, Yellowstone, which is like the biggest show period right now on TV, Barry, which is hugely talked about, The Rookie, which has a huge fan base, and The Purge show, as based on the movies, which is one that I really want to see, so I threw it in there. But yeah, the dramas here, I mean, again, absolutely outstanding. Sitcoms here are not as strong. Grownish is probably the biggest of them, but it's a spinoff to Blackish, which at this point was kind of, on its last leg, and a lot of people were starting to kind of feel like the show was jumping the shark a little bit. The just abundance of spin-offs that has come after at this point is really soured people on the show, and this was the first in a long line of them, so I could see why some people would turn on this show now, given what's come out since. The Neighborhood is kind of hit or miss. The Conners is definitely hit or miss. Kaminsky Method is another Chuck Lorre show, but I've never seen it, so I can't judge. AP Bio was like, it was successful enough for it to get a Peacock exclusive, to become a Peacock exclusive, and then it just disappeared because no one knows what Peacock exclusives are out there. And then Single Parents is another sitcom that just kind of came and went. And then the animated shows this year, we have Hilda, Paradise PD, Bluey, Big City Greens, and Craig of the Creek. I think Matt would be more, in line to judge some of these, but from what I've heard from people, that's probably the best lineup of like any of these genres. They're next to the dramas for sure. The animated shows really held their own here. Even the infamous trash, the Alec Baldwin show, which a lot of people didn't like because a lot of people don't like Alec Baldwin now, understandably. I thought that was great. I was a really big fan of that show. It was just a very simple talk show interview style. Alec Baldwin's a really good interviewer, and he had some really good guests on. So I never understood why people didn't like it, but a lot of people didn't, so there you go. But yeah, 2018 was overall a fantastic year. This is, again, borderline A1, but I'm going to put it at least in the great tier. Some of the sitcoms, I think, bring it down this year. I think that's really the one sort of weakest area with this one, but the dramas and the animated shows are phenomenal. 2019 overall was, a good year. Again, a lot of recognizable stuff, but kind of stuff that felt like it was a little, I don't know, like kind of came in and did its thing, but didn't really stick with you, you know? And I think part of that is just for the abundance of stuff at this point that was out there on TV. Like trying to research this and kind of narrow it down to a reasonable amount of shows to showcase was really hard by the time we got to like 2016, 2017, just because the amount of channels out there, the amount of streaming services that were popping up, there was just too much stuff to watch. So the shows that were good just didn't really get as much time to shine and really stick around like some of the older shows did. So for this one, we have Chernobyl, Stumptown, Nancy Drew, Weird City, The Boys, Morning Show, Mandalorian, Umbrella Academy, and All Rise for the dramas. Sitcoms were Mr. Iglesias, Bob Hearts Abishola, Schooled, Pen 15, Dollface, Mixed Dish, Unicorn, No Good Nick, Bless This Mess, and Bless the Hearts. And then some of the talk shows again and some of these variety shows. What Just Happened, Lights Out with David Spade, Kelly Clarkson Show, and A Little Late with Lily Singh. Most of those, you know, in any category are just kind of forgettable or just kind of filler TV. The ones that are good are, you know, solid enough for their respective fan base or, you know, if you're into that genre, but they don't really have the same mainstream appeal. The ones that are bad are just bad. Late Night with Lily Singh is a perfect example of that, as well as The Masked Singer, which I'm going to say is the worst show out of all of these because I've never understood its popularity. Somehow it's really big, though. But 2019 is not the worst year for TV. It's just kind of a forgettable one, so we'll put it in the good tier at least. 2020 is unfortunately another example of that because 2020 was kind of the opposite where there was like almost no TV showcased. So it has a lot of the similar problems in just a very different way. Big Sky, FBI Most Wanted, 911 Lone Star, Flight Attendant, Snowpiercer, Stargirl, and For Life for the dramas there. Central Park and Duncanville for some of the animated shows this year. There really weren't that many to pick from again, but those two I think are really solid. The Fox, sort of their animation domination lineup that you see there with Duncanville as one of their biggest ones, and then Central Park on Apple TV, that was one of their biggest originals when they were first starting out, like late 2019 or early 2020. That really put them into the streaming game and really showcased what they could do. Outmatched, Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist, Be Positive, and Dave for the live action sitcoms. You guys know how I feel about Outmatched. I think that show is awful. Zoe, I've never seen. Be Positive is another Chuck Lorre show I think is okay, but it's definitely not up to par with some of his other work. And then Dave is just kind of dumb. It's a Little Dicky, which never, you know, been the biggest Little Dicky fan. The reality shows here, we have Girl Scout Cookie Championship hosted by Allison Hannigan for some reason, Lego Masters, and Ultimate Tag. Those are all pretty just, you know, benign shows, don't really have a lot of impact there. And then probably the most famous of all these, but it didn't really fit in any of these categories, was Tiger King, which I've never seen, but from what I've heard from people is a very much love it or hate it show. Mike did not like it, but a lot of people did. So that's all I can say for that. But my least favorite show, if I had to pick, was definitely Space Force. I was very disappointed by that. Steve Carell, man, I can't say I really like a lot of his stuff, unfortunately, because the stuff that I have seen is just not very good, and that's another example of it. Wanted to like it because it has a huge cast behind it, but just couldn't get into the story. So 2020, you know, like I said, it did suffer quite a bit for obvious reasons, but I don't think it was the worst year ever. The dramas really save it this year because there were some really good ones in there. Every other category, though, was pretty underwhelming. And that leaves us with 2021 as our final year to go over before I reveal my top 10. And 2021 was a pretty phenomenal year for TV, man. A huge, huge redemption from 2020 here. I mean, every category has some really good stuff in it. The sitcoms this year for me and all the comedies really stood out. Abbott Elementary probably being the biggest show on this entire list for good reason, because it just absolutely has revitalized comedy for so many people, and the mockumentary style, which we haven't really seen in like a huge mainstream way since the days of like a Parks and Rec or The Office. iCarly 2021, absolutely great. Young Rock and Keenan, solid hits for NBC. Chad, American Auto, United States of Al, Kevin Can Fuck Himself, which is super underrated, and Schmigadoon, which is super underrated. So those two kind of anchoring the end there. Squid Game, another huge hit from this year for Netflix, of course. And the rest of the dramas really kind of focusing in on streaming mostly, aside from Law & Order Organized Crime, which was probably the biggest NBC new release, new drama in the Law & Order franchise there, which is great. But, I mean, when it came to 2021, streaming was the name of the game here, and the network rather, that really had it locked in for 2021 was Disney Plus, man. WandaVision, Loki, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and so many more that I didn't have time to list, all on Disney Plus there, in the Marvel TV show series. Those absolutely were like the biggest, most talked about shows, inescapable, absolutely everywhere. You knew about WandaVision, and even like some of the more advanced parts of the story and the details of it, even if you hadn't seen a single episode, because that's how much they were talked about everywhere. So that was really interesting to see, and I enjoyed WandaVision personally. I thought it was a great show. And then in other superhero shows, you also had Superman and Lois on the CW, which was one of their biggest hits, and really one of the only shows that's really keeping them afloat right now, and as far as the broadcast TV goes. So yeah, superhero shows really had a huge boost in 2021. That's a super popular type of drama there, so can't hold it against them there. For the animated shows, this was probably the weakest batch, honestly, because you had The Great North, which is pretty good, but then you had stuff like Camp Coral and The Patrick Star Show, which are just terrible, money grabs for Nickelodeon there, trying to bank off of SpongeBob, man. Just kind of disrespectful, more or less. So definitely the weakest ones there. And then What If is another animated show that's part of Marvel, and that was also on Disney Plus there, superhero. And then some of the game shows here, you have People Puzzler, Tuned In, and Crime Scene Kitchen, which were all pretty big in their own respective niches. Call Me Kat here, another pretty infamous sitcom that came out, definitely my least favorite. But like I said, those other sitcoms, man, more than make up for it. Between Abbott and iCarly, for me personally, my favorite too. So yeah, I think 2021 was a great year for TV. Pretty undeniable. It's honestly borderline A1 once again, but we're going to stick with the great tier for now. We'll have to see how a lot of these shows age, and a lot of these obviously are still on, and they're going to get their second or third seasons, into this year, 2022, and in next year, 2023. So we'll have to see how, they continue on with their success, because there's a good chance that a lot of these will fall off, but if they stay the course, I think they're going to be absolutely gigantic shows to come. So after looking over the tier list here, you can see all of the different years featured here. We have a good assortment of them, and obviously the bulk of them are just going to kind of end up in this good tier, a handful in the great tier and a handful in the meh tier. But really the extremes of this list, we're not really that prominent, because most years, given that there's going to be a ton of different shows for every single one of them, there's going to be some good and bad in almost all of them. So it's pretty unavoidable, and it was designed that way. But like I said at the top of the show, this was meant to be more of a discussion starter, comparing it to Mike's list and, my opinion. And I'd love to see what you guys say in the comments here. And I think just naturally, again, if you have a great year like 1999, it's not going to be a perfect year. That's really the thing to keep in mind when you're talking about this particular topic. 2000 is, not a completely unsalvageable year, but in comparison to everything else, it's definitely the weakest, fucking Caillou, I tell you. So when you look at this top 10, don't think of it as like the most objective, it's obviously going to be personal taste here. And I'm not going to say that all of these are perfect, and every single show that came out these years are 100% 10 out of 10, must-watch shows. But compared to what is out there, these are my personal favorites, top 10. 1993 at number 10, 2018 at number 9, 1987 at number 8, 2021 at number 7, 2005 at number 6, 2002 at number 5, 2010 at number 4, and our top 3, 2007, 1989, and my number 1 year, 1999. Thanks for joining me, everybody, for this TV tier list. I hope you guys did enjoy it. Let me know again in the comments what are some of your favorite TV years and what videos you'd like to see in a tier list fashion. If you have any ideas, feel free to drop them in the comments. With that, have a great rest of your day, everybody, and we'll see you in the next one.